live on the YouTube. Wyoming PBS here, a little better camera quality. So all you folks, make sure you got your makeup on and all your whiskers shaved and your nose hairs clipped.
Yeah, these cameras remove my hair.
A little better quality. Okay, are we good to go? Okay, can we please call the roll?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. For September 30th, Senator Baldwin,
Here.
Senator James, Senator Pappas,
Here.
Senator Schuler, Representative Baker, Representative Gray, Representative Hallinan, Representative Henderson,
Here.
Representative Jennings, Representative Roscoe, Representative Smith, Representative Yin,
Here.
Co-Chairman Case, Chairman Parson. All present, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I've been told these microphones, we had a few little hiccups, but the issue is really when there are 4 of them on at one time, then we have a little problem. So when you're not using yours, whether at the witness stand or here, to remember to turn those off. Okay, so we had a little change in the members. I understand you worked till 5:30. Appreciate your work for the people of Wyoming. And we moved one issue, which is industrial revenue bonds. So a real educational topic, and maybe there's some room for us to improve this program, to first thing this morning. And that's, and LSO, appreciate all the work you've done to get this ready. It's been really it's like a master's thesis over the last few months getting this ready. Been a lot of work and by our staff, and it's going to be presented today by Miss Donna Shippen with LSO staff. So we're going to turn that over to her.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to present a PowerPoint that corresponds with the memo that's in your meeting materials. So give me a minute here and I will share my screen. Okay, are you able to see the PowerPoint on your screen? If somebody can just let me know if you're able to see the PowerPoint.
I think we're good. Yeah, I think it looks real good.
All right, thank you. I did put page numbers on each slide that correspond with the page in the memo that reports the same information. I did add some additional information to this PowerPoint, additional information that I've gathered since the memo was written last April. So I'm just hoping to provide a general overview of industrial revenue bonds. Just to present a little background, this is an interim topic for the Revenue Committee, and the committee has also heard about industrial revenue bonds in the context of New Mexico's use of those bonds in wind project development. So they may be a little familiar to you. I'm hoping to present an overview of both taxable and tax-exempt IRBs, and then a little information about Wyoming's bonding authority and historic use of industrial revenue bonds. And then because you've had some experience with New Mexico's use of IRBs, I'm going to compare Wyoming statute with New Mexico's statute and use of IRBs as an economic development tool. So what are industrial revenue bonds? They're a type of municipal bond issued by local and state government to fund projects. They're different from general obligation bonds. General obligation bonds are backed by the government issuer and paid back with revenues available to the government issuer, such as tax revenues, fees, or the issuance of new bonds. Revenue bonds are backed by the revenue generated by the project itself. So there's no obligation of the government issuer to pay back the bond. Revenue bonds can be used to fund either public benefit projects, such as a public housing project, or private sector projects, such as a manufacturing facility. They're often used by local governments as an economic development tool. So bonds that are used to fund private sector projects are often referred to as private activity bonds. Industrial revenue bonds are a type of private activity bond. In an industrial revenue bond transaction, the government issuer loans the bond proceeds to the company to finance the project, and typically takes title to the financed facility. Typically, the company borrower leases the facility from the government issuer, constructs and equips the facility, then purchases the facility for a nominal price at the end of the bond term. Meanwhile, the bond is purchased by a bond investor. The company borrower is responsible for paying back the bond principal and interest to the bond investor with revenues generated from the project. So because the government issuer is acting as a conduit in this whole transaction, IRBs are often referred to as conduit bonds. So who purchases revenue bonds? Who are those investors? Revenue bonds can be purchased on the bond market. They can be purchased by banks or other commercial lenders that are providing project financing, or they can be purchased by the company itself that's building the project, and that's referred to as self-funding. So again, the government issuer has no financial obligation. They merely are acting as a conduit. Benefits of industrial revenue bond issues. For the government issuer, it's economic development. For the company borrower, they're receiving project financing or tax benefits. And for the bond investor, they're receiving investment income. If it's a tax-exempt bond, that income is also tax-exempt. So tax benefits of IRBs. Because the government issuer holds title to the property and assets, the project is exempt from property and other taxes for the bond term. And that's of course a benefit to the company borrower. Their property taxes are abated for the bond term, which is often 20 to 30 years. If a tax-exempt bond is issued, the bond interest is exempt from federal income tax, and that of course is a benefit to the bond investor. So as I mentioned earlier, private activity bonds can be either taxable or tax-exempt. If they're taxable, the bond interest is subject to federal income tax. Tax-exempt, of course, it's exempt from income tax. Tax-exempt bonds are able to offer lower rate financing because that interest is exempt. But the flip side is tax-exempt bonds are tightly regulated by the federal government under the Internal Revenue Code. So taxable bonds are often used instead to finance projects that don't meet those IRC qualifications. This slide talks about how the Internal Revenue Code regulates tax-exempt bonds. They regulate them in two ways. They regulate them by the type of activity you can fund with those bonds. Those activities are referred to as qualified private activities. The Internal Revenue Code also regulates bond volume that states can issue. Each state is allocated an annual volume cap. Wyoming receives the minimum cap, which is approximately $300 million each year. So those qualified private activities that you can fund with tax-exempt revenue bonds fall into 4 different types. You can issue qualified small issue bonds, which we will talk about more in a minute, because those are what IRBs would fall under. You can issue mortgage revenue bonds, qualified student loan bonds, or public benefit infrastructure bonds to finance public benefit infrastructure projects such as airports, electric power plants, sewage facilities. Qualified small issue bonds may be used to finance manufacturing facilities subject to IRC rules. So first they have to meet the IRC definition of a manufacturing facility. Second, the maximum aggregate face amount of the bonds issued is $10 million. You can't issue more than $10 million of bonds for the project. And at least 95% of the bond net proceeds must be used to acquire, construct, or improve land or depreciable property. Because those IRC regulations regarding tax-exempt bonds are so strict, oftentimes states such as New Mexico use taxable bonds to finance industrial development projects. If they don't meet the definition of an IRC manufacturing facility, and the project may cost more than $10 million. So New Mexico, which we'll talk about in a minute, uses taxable industrial revenue bonds predominantly. Just to pause for a moment here, I've thrown out a lot of terms, and it sometimes can be confusing. So when you're talking about industrial revenue bonds, they are a type of municipal bond. They're a type of private activity bond. They're often referred to as a conduit bond. If you're talking about a tax-exempt IRB, the IRC calls that a qualified small issue bond. And in Wyoming, we refer to them as industrial development bonds. That's what's in our statute. So just want you to know, if you hear these terms, we're talking about the same thing. These are all IRBs. In Wyoming, which I'm going to turn to next, I want to review what the state local government bonding authority is, and also Wyoming's historic use of taxable and tax-exempt IRBs. Just to provide an overview of who in the state has revenue bonding authority, this is a list of state entities that have revenue bonding authority. University of Wyoming and our community colleges also have revenue bonding authority. And then local governments have revenue bonding authority for several different purposes. So under the Wyoming Industrial Development Projects Act, cities, towns, counties, and joint powers boards can finance industrial development projects with IRBs, or we call them IDBs, industrial development bonds. Cities and towns can also issue revenue bonds for municipal improvements, as can special districts, to construct airports or hospitals, irrigation systems, etc. The Wyoming Industrial Development Project Act was passed in 1965. It's been amended several times since, and currently the statute provides authority to local governments to issue bonds to finance the creation or expansion of industrial development projects. So how are those projects defined? The projects are defined as any land, building, pollution control facility, or other improvement suitable for manufacturing, industrial, commercial, or business enterprises, or for a healthcare facility. Or the project can be an electrical generating facility or an energy improvements program. During the bond term, the statute or the act exempts projects from property taxes, but requires the project to make payments in lieu of taxes, which are referred to as pilot payments, which fully compensate the state and any political subdivisions and other recipients for the share of property taxes each would have received. This is an important provision to remember. When we talk about New Mexico, you'll see that New Mexico's statute differs from Wyoming's in this respect. So although our Industrial Development Projects Act has been on the books since 1965, in doing my research, I found that it seems to be this tool seems to be seldom utilized by Wyoming cities, towns, and counties in the past 20 years. In fact, I only found 3 IDB issues since 2004. And those issues are listed here. So in 2004, Bighorn County issued an IDB to Hawkins and Powers Aviation Company. And then in 2013, Johnson County and Sweetwater County issued IDBs to 2 uranium recovery projects. Wyoming did something that seems to be unique in that the state became the investor in these bonds. The state treasurer purchased these 3 IDBs. As I said earlier, usually industrial revenue bonds are funded by private investors or self-funded by the company that's constructing the project. In 2008, the legislature passed a statute that authorized the state treasurer to invest in IDBs. And this kind of tells you what the outcomes of the state's investment in those IDBs was. Hawkins and Powers defaulted on their payments and ended up going bankrupt. The state ended up losing money. The Uranus Nichols Ranch recovery project has been paid in full, but the Energy project has just been renegotiated. The bond was supposed to end this month, actually, and be repaid, but the bond terms have been renegotiated to extend the payments and allow interest-only payments until October of next year. And just so you know, the statute that allowed the state treasurer to purchase these bonds was repealed in 2016. So those 3 bonds, just to repeat, were all taxable industrial revenue bonds or industrial development bonds. How has Wyoming utilized its tax-exempt bond allocation in the past 10, 20 years? Right now, the current, or I should back up here, Wyoming statute gives the governor the authority to establish rules to allocate Wyoming state cap among state government units. Currently, the rules, which were promulgated in 2006, allocate $90 million to the Wyoming Community Development Authority, $30 million to the Wyoming Student Loan Corporation, and the remainder to a general allocation pool that's available to other entities such as Wyoming towns and counties who would like to issue a tax-exempt bond. Just to note, Wyoming Student Loan Corporation was dissolved in 2016, but these rules haven't been updated apparently. Right now, that $30 million that's allocated to Wyoming Student Loan Corporation is being rolled over to the WCDA. With one exception, WCDA has been the only local or state entity that's utilized the state's tax-exempt bond allocation since 2011. WCDA typically uses about half of our $300 million allocation to issue mortgage revenue bonds and mortgage credit certificates. The one exception I found was in 2020, Converse County applied for and was allocated $10 million for issuance of a tax-exempt IDB to Slate Refining to restart the former Antelope crude oil refinery. The bond has been authorized, but it has yet to be issued. This slide, and I apologize, it's hard to read. This is a chart that shows WCDA's allocation and then the amount of carry forward or rollover that WCDA receives since other, for instance, that includes the Wyoming Student Loan Corporation allocation and the general allocation pool. And then what WCDA is using each year, the amount of mortgage revenue bonds that they're issuing, the amount of mortgage credit certificates, and then the amount of the volume cap that's going unused. And as this slide shows, Under IRC rules, states have 3 years to use their tax-exempt state volume cap. After 3 years, those unused allocations expire. So in any given year, typically half of our $300 million volume cap is expiring, is unused. So now let's talk about New Mexico. I'm going to review how New Mexico uses IRBs as an economic development tool and compare their statutes to ours. So IRBs are a leading economic development tool in New Mexico. As this slide shows, they've issued multiple bonds worth billions of dollars in the past 30, 40 years. These are examples of projects that were funded with IRBs in New Mexico, and you'll notice on this list is Red Mesa Wind Farm, which is an example of one of the wind projects that's been funded with IRBs. IRBs are actively marketed by New Mexico cities and counties. This slide shows a web page from the Albuquerque Economic Development website, and you'll see that industrial revenue bonds are at the top of the list of business incentives that Albuquerque is marketing to companies they're hoping to attract. I talked with the director of the Economic Development Division of the New Mexico Economic Development Department, and I asked him, how is it that your cities and counties seem to be so knowledgeable of IRBs as an economic development tool? And this is how he responded. He said the department's very aggressive in educating local governments about the advantages of IRBs. The department has what they call regional reps around the state, and these reps regularly make presentations on IRBs and other business incentives to local governments and to local businesses. So New Mexico issues mostly taxable IRBs, and again, the director of the Economic Development Division told me that most of these IRBs are self-funded by the company borrower. So these companies utilizing these aren't really needing or looking for financing. They're able to come with their own financing or find their own financing. What they're looking for are tax benefits, and these IRBs offer them attractive tax benefits. So New Mexico has 2 enabling statutes. They have a County Industrial Revenue Bond Act and a Municipality Industrial Revenue Bond Act. Both statutes are very similar to Wyoming's statute, with 2 important exceptions. In Wyoming, as I said earlier, our statute exempts property taxes during the bond term. The New Mexico statute exempts all state and political subdivision taxes during the bond term. So that would include property, gross receipts, taxes, and income taxes. Wyoming statute requires the company borrower to make pilot payments to fully compensate the state and any political subdivisions for lost property tax revenue. The New Mexico statute does not require any pilot payments. That said, however, when New Mexico cities and counties negotiate these IRB agreements, they are often restricting the amount of property tax abatement by either limiting the bond term. For instance, Albuquerque won't issue a bond for a period longer than 20 years, or by negotiating pilot payments that cover a percentage of the lost property tax revenue, and typically that percentage is enough to cover the school district portion of the lost revenue, so that school districts are not losing out on these deals. As the director of New Mexico's Economic Development Division explained it to me, New Mexico cities and towns see that by taking a short-term loss of property taxes, the local government is realizing a long-term gain. Typically, New Mexico IRB project sites are raw, undeveloped land that are generating little property tax revenue. By foregoing that small amount of property tax revenue for the bond term, they're allowing that land to be developed. At the end of the project, the property reverts to the title to the property reverts to the company. Now they start paying their property taxes, but it's assessed at a higher value because it's now developed land, and generates higher tax revenues for years to come. So takeaways that I realized doing this research project are that Wyoming cities, towns, and counties have the authority to issue industrial development bonds, but they seem to seldom utilize those. As far as our tax-exempt bonds go, the Wyoming Community Development Authority is the only entity that regularly utilizes the state's $300 million tax-exempt bond allocation. And then each year, approximately half of that allocation expires as unused. Further takeaways are that the New Mexico Economic Development Department aggressively educates their local governments on IRBs, and in turn, those local governments actively market IRBs as an economic development tool. And the New Mexico IRB statute provides greater tax incentives than our statute does. And now I'll take any questions that committee members may have.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions, members? Representative Gray? Or did you have a hand?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Representative Gray.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very curious on the constitutional issues here. Whenever we talk about property tax issues, I've had a lot of bills to get controls for residential. There's a chorus that always says that it's unconstitutional, and yet apparently, a blanket exemption has been deemed constitutional. This is, I think, the kind of thing that the Constitution might contemplate more so than looking within a class like a residential class and saying, oh, we're going to put a cap on, or we're going to have controls. So anyway, I'm just wondering in your research what that dichotomy and why this passes constitutional muster.
Thank you. I think who the owner is, I think is the answer, but I'll let Ms. Shippen go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, I'm going to start by saying I'm not an LSO attorney, but in my research, I did notice that there's some case law that followed Wyoming's passage of the Industrial Development Projects Act, and I think it was initially challenged as unconstitutional, but I believe those court cases all decided that it was within the Constitution. I can't provide you details about that case law, but that's certainly something LSO would be willing to do research on if the committee so desired.
Okay, and I'm going to throw this over to our attorney here with us, Mr. Anderson. You want to comment on that, on Representative Gray's question?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. And again, I haven't looked deeply into the cases that Ms. Shippen referenced, but the next section in the Constitution, so there's Article 15, Section 11 that you're referencing, that provides limits on how property taxes can be administered. But then there's Article 15, Section 12, which does allow for property tax exemptions for state and municipally held property, primarily when used for a governmental purpose, but then also such other property as the legislature may provide. So I'm guessing that was the use of these bonds was determined to be within that authorization for the legislature to provide exemptions.
Okay, thank you. I think Senator Schumer, and then we'll go. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions for you. First of all, when you talked about pilot payments Would those be like matching funds, a percentage of the total bond? There wasn't really an explanation of what those were. That's my first question. And then I've got a couple more for you.
Okay, did you hear that?
I
Yeah.
did. Mr. Chairman, Senator Schuler, my understanding of pilot payments is they are fees that are negotiated as part of the industrial development bond issuance to cover lost property tax revenue, because the property taxes are exempted during the bond term. In New Mexico, the pilot payments are negotiated are just a fraction of the lost property tax revenue. Wyoming statute requires that those pilot payments fully compensate or make up for lost revenue, the state's portion of lost property tax revenue, and then any political subdivisions such as school districts, special districts, portion of the property tax revenue. I hope that answers your question.
That does. Could I have a follow-up, Mr. Chairman? Thank
Yeah,
you.
Mr.
Yeah, the next question I had is, I appreciate you bringing up the fact that New Mexico really aggressively educates those local governments, because I've heard of, municipal bonds, but I have not known of any, cities or towns in my area that have taken advantage of them. So I appreciate you taking a look at that so that we understand maybe why we haven't taken advantage of them in Wyoming. But I guess my other question is there a downside to these industrial revenue bonds? What is the downside? I mean, I see a lot of pluses, but is there a downside to them that you can talk about? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Schuler, in Wyoming's experience, I think the downside was the state made the decision to invest in some of these bonds, and it wasn't always, they didn't always come out ahead. New Mexico doesn't do that. The bonds are often self-funded are typically self-funded by the company that the bond is issued to. I wasn't told when I talked with New Mexico, they didn't share any downsides with me. That's certainly something that I could look at further. But at this point, I don't have any information to share with you.
Okay, next was Representative Jennings and then Representative Hallinan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So mine actually dovetails with the senators. As I'm looking at this, we have a 9-year running track record that you've given us, and really only 3 that went through, and 2 problems, major problem with one and problem possibly with the second one. So, for us to make a good decision on this, could we look at the failures in not necessarily New Mexico, maybe some other states, because that looks like 66% that has had problems and only 33% doing good. Could we look and get some information on the failure side of this a little more, perhaps? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Shippen?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Jennings, I'd be happy to do more research, look at other states, and also look more for negatives as well as positives.
Okay, Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Shippen, the fact that Wyoming bought these bonds and then took a loss on them with the PWMTF funds, why did the state buy these bonds in the first place? Was there no interest by investors in these bonds? Is that why?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hallinan, I don't have specific information on this. I'd be happy to look more. I believe the decision was made as part of what was known as the Wyoming Public Purpose Investment Program to purchase these bonds. Whether there were other bond investors out there, I couldn't tell you. But I'd be happy to look into that further.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other questions, members of the committee? Okay, and I just want to, okay, Senator James, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I was looking at Article 16, Section 6, where it talks about loan of credit, donations prohibited, and works of internal improvement. More specifically, little b, where it says the state shall not engage in any work of internal improvement unless authorized by 2/3 of the vote of the people. Would these IDBs and IRBs fall under that category where when one of these are done, that it needs to go to a bond election?
Ms. Shippen?
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, that's a very good question. So revenue bonds do not have to be voted on by the electorate. That's one of the areas where they differ from general obligation bonds, which do require a public vote.
Okay, thank you. Follow up, Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So where does the pilot money go? If it's not going to where property taxes would go, then where is it going? Thank you.
Go ahead, Ms. Shippen.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, those pilot payments are distributed by the city or county that issues the bonds to the state and to the political subdivisions that would have received the property tax revenues.
Okay, follow up?
So if I understand correctly, while they're not paying property taxes, they're paying property taxes if they're going to the same places, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, you're correct. And that is why under Wyoming statutes, industrial development bonds really don't offer much of a tax incentive. My understanding of the statute is the only entity that's not receiving their property tax share is the city or county that issued the bond, but everybody else is receiving money equivalent to their property tax share, so it's really not saving the company borrower much money in terms of what they need to pay out.
So in short, Wyoming has the program, but the key differences you lined out were really that New Mexico exempts them from all taxes during the term of the loan and does not require a full pilot like Wyoming. And I'm just kind of repeating what I think I heard from you. Wyoming requires a full pilot. New Mexico is a negotiated pilot with the local entity. And then of course the education piece, where it's kind of part of their culture.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. That's my understanding as well.
That's a big difference. Okay, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last one. So if I understand correctly, when the company defaults, we're just out that money that we gambled the people's money on. Am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, the money that funds an industrial revenue bond comes from the bond investor, not from the local government that issues the bond. So that money, that bond could be sold on the bond market. It could be purchased by a bank or lender, that's acting as a lender for the industrial project, or it could be funded by the company itself if they have sufficient financial resources. Oftentimes they have an affiliate or a parent company that purchases the bond, and the company's merely interested in the bond for its tax savings, not as a financing mechanism. So there is no local government money that's issued or that's goes into these bonds. The local government entity merely acts as a conduit. I think it becomes confusing because back in the 2000s, Wyoming as a state, made a decision to invest state funds in some of these bonds. And so Wyoming became the bond investor. And then when, the Hawkins and Powers bond, when Hawkins and Powers defaulted, Wyoming, the state of Wyoming as the investor lost money. But typically states and local government funds are not being used, and typically states are not investing in these. That seems to have been a very unusual approach that Wyoming took. I hope that answers your question.
I think you did. And then to also add to that, the state of Wyoming no longer does that. We repealed that part of the statute. That was for just a few short years and a couple projects. So Senator James has one more follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is more of a clarification. So I wasn't necessarily referring to that. What I was referring to is right now we're receiving funds in place of property taxes that go where normally property taxes would go. So if a company defaults, we would no longer receive those property taxes. And if they hadn't done this, they hadn't gone through this process, then we would be receiving those property taxes. Am I understanding that correctly? No?
I think somebody defaults and doesn't pay their taxes, they default and don't pay their taxes. And really that's, I think, Ms. Shippen, anything else to add to that, or?
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, I think just to clarify, yes, during the bond term, the company is making those pilot payments to the government entity, such as the county that issued the bond. Those pilot payments are being distributed to the state and any political subdivisions, to make up for lost property tax revenue. If the company defaults on that bond, then the lease, the county holds title to that property. The company borrower is leasing the property from the county during the bond term. If there was a default, that lease would terminate. The title, now would go back to the company, and they would no longer receive a property tax exemption, and they would have to start paying their property taxes again, is my understanding of how it would work.
I think Representative Jennings.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you might be able to answer this as easy. So I think you touched on it there. It would go back. Does it go back to the state? If the state is putting the money out here, does it go back to the county? Does it go back to the people that were borrowing the money?
Ms. Shippen?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Jennings, so again, and in the state isn't funding this bond. It's either a private investor or the company itself is self-funding the bond. If there was a default, the company is leasing the property from the county or the city that issued the bond during the bond term. So if there were a default and the lease was terminated, the property title would go back to the original owner of that property, which would be the company that owns the property they're developing the project on. Does that answer your question, Representative Jennings?
Mr. Chairman, so that kind of, it kind of does, but it leads to another question. So the property owner, the original property owner, owned undeveloped land, and the property taxes were low, theoretically. And then they come in and they build. Now they have developed property. And so when it goes back to that original owner, now they're paying taxes on developed. Is that correct?
Just go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Jennings, that's correct. And that is what the benefit is in these bond issues, is that you end up with developed land that generates higher property tax revenue.
Ms. Shippen, just really appreciate your work on this. And my takeaway from this is really, if Wyoming wants to get in the game with this and use these conduit bonds, we really are gonna have to probably change a couple. First of all, we don't have many taxes to give away. You listed all those in New Mexico, income, gross receipts, all those. We don't have any of those, but we probably have to get in the game of really just exempting all those taxes during that term and not requiring a full pilot, you know, maybe require half a pilot or whatever, and then probably get the Wyoming Business Council in this game as well, get them, you know. Those are my 3 takeaways. Is there anything else or anything I'm missing there? But that seems to be the big difference, because New Mexico is kind of the poster child for this whole body. You see all those national companies that have moved there. But it's really a local government thing. It's not a state thing. The state kind of helps with the education piece. Is that how, am I kind of re-summarizing that correctly, or anything you want to correct me on or add to?
Mr. Chairman, you're correct in all of the above. Just, you know, to reiterate, the state is not funding these. In New Mexico, the state's taking the role of educating local governments about the benefits of issuing industrial revenue bonds. Just to add a little information, you know, to the discussion about taxes and the tax exemptions that New Mexico provides, you're correct. New Mexico exempts all taxes, which would include property, gross receipts, and income tax. As we all know, Wyoming doesn't have an income tax, corporate or personal, but we do have the equivalent of a gross receipts tax, which is sales tax. Our statute doesn't mention, our statute only exempts property tax payments. There's no mention of sales tax exemptions under these IDB agreements. So that may be something for Wyoming to consider.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Representative Henderson is online and he has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for the very good summary on this industrial development bond area. My question goes to, you know, we have an issue of availability of affordable housing in Wyoming, particularly a couple of counties, Laramie County and Teton, for example. And so you had indicated that the WCDA has made fairly consistent use of this each year as far as the exempt amount. Would there be a possibility of getting more information on to what areas those monies have been applied, and perhaps additional opportunity that may be available through the WCDA?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, I'm glad you asked that question. I didn't put this into the slideshow, but in doing my research, my understanding is that WCDA utilizes their tax-exempt bond allocation mostly for single-family home mortgage revenue bonds, or mortgage revenue bonds to finance single-family home mortgages. I did come across at least one instance where money was allocated for a public housing project. I looked into how New Mexico utilizes their tax-exempt bond cap, and they seem to utilize it mostly for multifamily housing. So that really jumped out at me when I saw that. So and yes, I could gather more information about that and just to see how often, how much Wyoming utilizes their bond cap for multifamily housing, if you'd like.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in that line, we have a 300 cap. So is there opportunity there to perhaps look at the allocation and maybe work towards helping the WCDA on that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, I'd be happy to follow up with the WCDA and gather more information about that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think Representative Hallinan has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, in the event that one of these homeowners doesn't make their payment completely to the investor, does the investor have any action against the state? Can they sue us for issuing this bond in the first place?
Shipping?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hallinan, my understanding is no, but I will look into that to give you a more certain answer.
Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious what the criteria for qualifying for these, the home revenue bond, or, yeah.
Usually, I think, in Miss Shipping, maybe you can answer. It seems like they're first-time home buyers, those kind of things. Do you have any comment on that, or we can get that information?
Mr. Chairman, I believe you're correct. I believe they're used to finance mortgages for first-time home buyers, but I can confirm that with the WCDA.
Right, usually there's an income threshold and all that kind of thing. Senator James has no follow-up.
Yeah, follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I was wondering, do people use this because they don't qualify through the normal process, or how do people come about using one of these?
Okay, so question on the WCDA loans. We can probably get, do you have any more info on that, or we can dig that up somewhere else?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I'm not qualified to answer that.
Yeah, that's a different, so really, to summarize this, I mean, there's zero government money in this. We've repealed any of that. State's not investing. That was back a couple treasures ago when we invested in these projects, and that is no longer allowed in our statute. So really, it's just being a conduit. And the reason I guess they're not used is we don't have really any tax incentives to do it like New Mexico does. We don't offer any. That's my understanding of it. Is anything else really? You want to correct me on that or add to it? But there's zero government money in this.
Mr. Chairman, you're correct. There are no government funds involved.
Simply a conduit. Okay, any other questions, members? I think Representative Sweeney.
I just like to make a couple of comments. Back when it was funded through the legislative action, I've got experience, had applied, and couple of issues. I felt that it was Wyoming investing in itself when Wyoming actually did purchase those bonds and back those. Hawkins and Powers was unfortunate, but they had an accident and it wiped them out. They were a very good employer and did great things. The uranium mines, again, investing in ourselves rather than at the time. I think we might have gotten 1 to 2% return on the permanent mineral Wyoming trust funds, and in my mind, that was a good deal. Some of the problems were probably self-created on not understanding the program, because it wasn't interest-free. You did have through the process, it was repayable. They took the property as the state would have the property as collateral. And the problem in my mind with the whole program was that it took over 2 years to get through the process. And for most companies, it just doesn't work to take that extraordinary amount of time to go through the process. So if we brought this back or highlighted. I think the idea of workforce housing is a really great example of where it could be utilized that I hadn't thought about, but there's a lot of things. The Business Council vetted the whole program. That wasn't really the hangup in my case. It was a switch of treasurers. We had the deal completed with Treasurer Meyer, but when Treasurer Gordon took over, he didn't agree, as Treasurer Meyer and Governor Meade had agreed, and the Business Council had recommended going through the process. So I think it was a beneficial program. Obviously, it hit the constitutional muster and was in Wyoming, investing in Wyoming for future jobs, economic development, and the return on investment, which at the time, my recollection was 4% interest, and was better than the return that we were receiving at that time because we were restricted from equities at that point in time. So investments. So I think it was a great program. I was sad that it was sunsetted, even though I wasn't successful. And again, Wyoming, investing in Wyoming for Wyoming jobs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Okay, members, is there any more? Do you want to have any action, any direction for staff on this? Anybody have any? Go ahead, Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I think this is a good way to incentivize economic development in our state, but I think the presentation really highlighted the difference between what we have in statute and what New Mexico has. So, you know, I think I will motion for a bill draft to adjust our project authority to, instead of require a full pilot that repays the exact property tax, to be something like a half pilot requirement that could be negotiated with the municipality or county. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Turn my mic on. So we have this motion and a second on a bill draft proposal to really adjust this pilot percentage from 100% to up to 50% there, a requirement of 50% is how I understand. Is that correct? Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, we want Representative Jennings.
So the 50%, Mr. Chairman, thank you. So the 50%, do we have direction on where that would go?
I'll ask Representative Yen that.
Mr. Chairman, I think it makes the most sense to proportionally dole it out the way the property tax mills would be proportionate for that piece of land. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, any other question, discussion? All those favor of that bill draft for our next meeting, just raise your hand. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Anybody online? Yeah, looks like it's at least 10. Anybody opposed to that bill draft? Looks like 2. Okay, so we'll have a draft that we can work this issue a little bit next go round. Okay, just want to thank LSO and Ms. Shippen and we've had a lot of folks work this issue. Appreciate it. And it's good to educate all of us about it over time. We kind of forget some of these things as members change. Okay, very good. Next item on our agenda then, we're on to energy and public utilities taxes. And Mr. Co-Chair, I think you're gonna start off on this and gonna be our presenter on this issue, our resident expert.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And we do have a PowerPoint kind of to introduce the subject. So I'd hope that Katie could help me get that up. And so this is going to be the case for an electricity tax in Wyoming. There's no pun intended, but I thought that was funny. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is an extraordinary thing about Wyoming is that we are a substantial player in energy markets. We produce 14 times more energy than we consume. You know, coal, oil, and electricity, they're big players in Wyoming. Electricity is one of our top exporters. We have one very big company, Rocky Mountain Power. They export 85% of the generation. And most of our generation is using coal. And if you kind of look in there, this is very recent data, June of 21. Coal-fired electricity was, I think that number, it's hard to read, but I think it's 78, almost 79%. So we've been journeying towards renewables and things, but in June of 21, most of it was fired by coal. These traditional generating sources, the fossil fuel sources, we all know the story there. They run our state's economy. They provided most of our revenues to the state. They've been extraordinary good partners. We have, you know, the methods of generating electricity, of course, are changing. The taxes provided are a little bit different. They don't have a big workforce of miners, and we don't collect severance tax, and there's just on and on. If we could have the next slide, we can see a little bit more about our electricity profile. I think it's hard to read on this, but you can see that the net generation in terms of, you know, is extraordinary. It's several times what we consume. So that, you know, 60% of generation. Yeah, thank you very much. Katie, can you slide over? You're doing so great. Okay, this is in megawatt hours. Net generation is 42 million megawatt hours. And if we look at 42 million megawatt hours, and if we look at our consumption, it's only about 16 million megawatt hours. So the next slide, please, Katie. The world's changing out there. I got to get this one smaller, but you're doing great. So let's talk about the traditional things that we're looking at. This is our coal production. And remember, this is the big Cohini, and it's still paying the freight in Wyoming. But the problem is coal is on its way out. And if you look, Wyoming coal, it doesn't have any other uses besides thermal. It's just used for electrical generation. West Virginia is having a little bit of a revival because they're shipping a lot of coal overseas to Germany, in fact, for metallurgical purposes. Wyoming coal doesn't have a metallurgical use. You can't, you know, doesn't run foundries and things like that. So our coal production is exclusively tied to particular power plants. Every one of those power plants that we ship coal to is slated for closure. There's a time frame. Each utility has a resource plan, and they've talked about when they want to close these plants, but it's dialed in. And it's dialed in because of policies with respect to global warming and what states want. So coal is realistically, it's declining. We have some Hail Marys out there. One is carbon sequestration. You guys decide on yourself if that's going to be a Hail Mary that's going to save the industry in time before all these plants close. They'll never reopen these plants once they close. I guarantee you that. The other Hail Mary that's out there is ports, maybe exporting coal. Certainly, it looks good on paper. China in the next 10 years will build more power plants fired with coal than we ever had in the United States. But yet how are we going to get the coal to them? That doesn't appear to be particularly easy. So it's up to you to decide, but I expect we're going to dial in a decrease in coal. Next slide, please. Oil and gas. Oil and gas. Let's talk about oil and gas in Wyoming. Oil and gas has been produced in Wyoming for a very long time. Our fields are very old. We're applying some of the best technology to keep those fields going. We're making new discoveries. We're using more expensive drilling techniques. But really, the future of oil and gas is also not as bright as it once was. So I just ask you, these were speculative questions last year. They've practically come true now. How likely do you think it will be that in 10 years or 2030, half of all the new cars produced in the United States or around the world will be electric? I think that's pretty likely. How likely is it that both houses of Congress will have pro-climate and anti-carbon policies based on the makeup of the Congress and the Senate? Pretty likely, I think. How likely do you think that the U.S. will seek a position in the next decade to be a global leader in reducing greenhouse gases? Pretty likely. We rejoined the Paris Accord. We're talking about commitments. These are things that we don't control in Wyoming. And whether you like it or not, and I'm not commenting on that, just saying this is a dialed in, realistic thing that's happening. So how likely do you think that new oil production in Wyoming will continue to be restricted over the next decade? Who owns the minerals in Wyoming? Who owns the surface? It's not the people in Wyoming. It's our friends in Washington and share with the country. So what do you think the policies dialed in about being a global leader with respect to combating global warming will be with respect to production? And then you add to this the fact that technologically our fields are very old and they're expensive to produce. And the big plays probably aren't out there in the future. And every oil field starts to decline once it starts producing. So anyway, these are some of the clips that you see out there, and people have big plans to get us off of oil and gas. Next slide, please. We talked about how coal has been the mainstay of our electricity production, but that's changing. And these are the things that we're just talking about in Wyoming right now. And my point that I'm making here is that even though the generation techniques are changing, we're going to be a player in producing electricity. And we need to think about positioning ourselves with respect to the future production of electricity. These are the technologies that are coming about. We all know about the announcement on the nuclear plant. Is that going to happen? I don't know, but it is a proposal by two of the biggest billionaires in the country. And they're not the ones jumping up into space all the time. These are the two steadiest billionaires we have. And if anybody can do it, I bet they can. That's going to be in Wyoming's future. And we do mine uranium, and there's a severance tax on uranium, but connecting our uranium to this particular nuclear plant or any future nuclear plants in Wyoming will be pretty hard to do because we don't process, and there's all these supplies available still in the world. So I don't know that the tax revenues from the production side will be like coal. I think it'll, this is going to be just like a big factory. Wind, we all hear about wind, and wind is certainly a big part of Wyoming. This is a story about the biggest wind project in North America planned in Wyoming. Solar, you all noticed, I think you got a project pretty far underway now in Casper. We've got a big project and others planned. Solar's important. Wyoming's a good location for solar because of our clear skies, our sunny days, and also because of the curvature of the earth and the fact that our supplies come on a little bit earlier than California's supply, so it can kind of help them with their needs out there. We get, sun comes up earlier here. And so geothermal, not a lot going on with geothermal, but a lot of people believe that geothermal is one of the big pieces of our future generation needs. And Mr. Chairman, this is a bill that you had sponsored last year. I'm sorry to say that our Our friends in the Senate didn't see the merits of this, and it failed on general file. But I think that bill will probably be back, and geothermal is going to be pretty important. Hydro and storage, that's the next big source there at the very bottom. So, everybody's talking about coupling renewable resources, which are intermittent, with some kind of storage, which would be like batteries. People talk batteries all the time. Batteries aren't really cutting it very well. Batteries are very expensive. They don't solve, at best right now, they're providing like 2 hours of electricity. And you could triple your cost on batteries and you get 6 hours of electricity. So really, they're going to be important. Don't get me wrong. We may have battery installations in Wyoming providing electricity. That'd be pretty cool. But really, the one technology that more and more people are looking at, it's expensive and it's difficult, is called pump storage hydro. There's a great Wyoming kid that's working on this. There's, these are large pumping projects that Wyoming has locations that are amenable to this. So that could be a big piece of our future. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please, Katie. Most likely, if we were to take advantage of electricity production in the future and levy a tax, it'd most likely be a gross receipts tax. So we had a bill before, and this is the language that we had: levied an excise tax upon the privilege of producing and selling electricity, imposed on the sale of electricity produced in Wyoming, and I threw a date out there, 2023, and shall be paid by the person producing the electricity. So it's a tax on the annual gross earnings. I want to be really clear. Everybody thinks I'm trying to kill rooftop solar, and this would exempt all these net metering customers, small utilities. This would be for the big boys, the utility players. The key about a gross receipts tax, we have all these other taxes that go into producing electricity, including severance, ad valorem on the stuff that's mined, and property taxes from the mines, and just, on and on and on, is that a gross receipts tax is technology neutral, and it will adapt as our generation mix changes over time. So, we can get in the business of encouraging electricity to be generated here and get the tax benefits. Whereas right now, if we encourage, for example, renewable energy, we don't get as much tax benefits as we've been getting with our coal or other fossil fuels. Next slide, please, Katie. Thank you. I think it might be very important to think about our Constitution and expand this concept, because remember, the Constitution, Article 15, Section 18, provides for the circumstance that if we were to put in an income tax, that full credit would be offered for other taxes paid. Well, that rings true for me in terms of possibly a gross receipts tax as well, so that you don't overburden, you don't double down on the taxes of generation methods that are already carrying a lot of the weight in Wyoming. So in order to do that, though, we'd have to expand it to include the taxes paid by upstream suppliers, like your severance and your ad valorem paid by our fossil fuel industries, which are going away, but they're not going away right away. And they're down, they're going out. This way we wouldn't be kicking them while they're down. So that's one concept. And Katie, next slide, please. So we got to think about this in terms of all tax burdens are relative. And people that are opposed to tax, they talk about taxes in isolation, say, oh, you're imposing this tax and no other state has this tax. You hear that all the time. But the point I'd like to make is that the tax burden in Wyoming is a component of many different factors, many different kinds of taxes. And we all know that our other taxes are pretty light in Wyoming. So that the relative tax burden that would be on someone depends on the totality of the taxes imposed in the relevant market or by the relevant state. So other states do tax electricity in different ways. Some do have a production tax. Most have a corporate income tax or a gross receipts tax. Most have higher rates for sales and property taxes than Wyoming does. Or unlike Wyoming, they impose the sales tax on more things. So if we just look, and it's, in the electricity world, it's kind of important to look at where the grids are. Now, this will change over time as the grids are more connected with DC interties, but right now, it's 60 cycle electricity throughout the country, meaning that there's a tremendous number of flywheels out there, generators turning at 60 times a second, 3,600 times a minute, all throughout the country. But all the flywheels in the yellow are turning at the exact same time. And they're turning 60 times a second, but slightly differently than the flywheels in the blue and the flywheels in the green, which is our friends in Texas. So we have to pay attention for the physics of this. It's not very easy to take electricity from blue and give it to yellow. So our competitors are really these Western states. For now, that may break down over time as new technologies come in about DC interties, direct current, so they don't have that problem of trying to take a flywheel turning at this time with a flywheel that's turning at this time and try to mash them together. It's not a good thing. So anyway, if you look at just the yellow, the Western grid, we own our competitors that don't have an income tax are Wyoming and Nevada. California, New Mexico, they all have those taxes. All right, next slide, please, Katie. Think about a little bit about how much, it's always a good idea to export your tax burden, I suppose, up to a point. This is a chance to do that. I'm using Rocky Mountain Power Territory because they export the most electricity of anyone in Wyoming. So in Rocky Mountain Power Territory, 85% of the electricity is exported out of state. A key point for our residential and our commercial consumers is they are a tiny fraction of the Wyoming production. So Wyoming residential and commercial customers are only 4% of consumption. If the tax is proportionally levied down to them, they'll pay 4%. Now, I don't know about you, but if you can have a tax burden of 4% and somebody else pays the rest of it, that's a good deal for Wyoming. That's almost as good as our severance taxes have been and everything. So it's a good deal. Now, we got to talk about who else is paying a lot of electricity in Wyoming, or buying a lot of electricity in Wyoming, and that's very important. But this 15% of total production is in Wyoming, paid for by Wyoming consumers. You break down into that and you see that of that 15%, most of it is industrial load. And that industrial load is 74% of the amount that's consumed in Wyoming. The residential and commercial is less than, is 26%, but it's only 4% of the total. The industrial load is only 11% of the total. Okay. I think we should talk about these industrial customers. So let's look at the next one. I'm not quite there yet. So we have more industrial load than any other state in the country. When I worked for the commission in Illinois, worked on utility rates, we had about a 20% industrial load. So it was very common to give industrial customers a break on their power rates to encourage economic development, but we had 80% of the rest of the state to pay for it. Here in Wyoming, it's flipped upside down. It's more than any other state, and we have to pay attention to this. This is important. It's important to Ashley's taxpayer members, and this is important. Keep your eye on this ball. So nationwide, the amount that's industrial load is only about 33%. Wyoming, 74%. You know who these industries are. They're the big players, refineries, Bitcoin miners, that's a new one, data centers, trona and coal mines, oil fields, more. So how do we make this fair for them? This is important. Let's go let's go back to that notion that we had about the credits and the state provision on the income tax, that we recognize the other taxes paid. Dial that into your brain. Let's go to the next slide. These are the companies we're talking about. You recognize these companies, you know these companies. There are Trona, our oil and gas, our refineries. A big one is Microsoft. And another big one is Greenhouse Data, which is actually Greenhouse Data is owned by that company Lunavi down there. I think that's how you say it. Now there's this big company up there called Wyoming Mining Company. You're figuring, I wish Mr. Detai were here today because we'd ask him if they are a member of Mr. Detai's Wyoming Mining Association. Well, they're not. This is a Bitcoin miner. They use tremendous amounts of electricity. It's enormous. They use the amount of our largest cities. Here's the key here. All of these companies are making choices about the electricity that they want to consume. Now, let me say time out here for a second. I'm not talking about competitive choices where we have full competition in Wyoming. You actually say, I want electricity from this supplier. We're not there yet in Wyoming. We may be get there sometime. But if we think about a subscription process, at least for the tax implications, we can make this tax work better for our industrial customer friends. So, and just for the tax implications. So in terms of the tax implications, some will choose to have their power come from some types of sources that may be already heavily taxed. Others might choose to take their power from sources that are lightly taxed and may be better for the environment. Let's see the next slide. This conceptually, I'm just talking about the subscription for tax purposes. But there are some real power choices that are available in Wyoming now. For example, for renewable energy, some customers already subscribe to 100% renewable, or as close to 100% as they can get. They pay extra for it. The utility works with them on that. Microsoft Data Center, this is the Cheyenne Center. It says it signed a deal for the largest purchase of wind energy in the history, enough to provide its data center in Cheyenne. That's what that story is about. So it's not exactly real utility competition where you're choosing your supplier, but it sort of is something that the company is making a commitment to the planet and wants to pay extra and get green power. And they get the same electrons as everybody else, but they're paying a little bit more for the subscription to the power. We could do the same thing for tax purposes. And then if we look, we've had some legislation in this area about coal plant extensions and things like that. There's a company called Glenrock Energy that's interested in buying a coal plant and sequestering the carbon and using the carbon dioxide to enhance oil recovery. And so our law already actually provides that if a utility wants to, or if a customer actually wants to buy the output of a coal-fired power plant, utility needs to figure out how to get it to them. There's rules, there's extra charges and all that, but basically it's already in the law that you can physically get coal-fired power if it's one of these power plants that's resold, leaves the utility and goes to someone else. I'm not saying we do that. I'm just saying that for tax purposes, we let these customers just kind of say which power there comes from. Next slide, please, Katie. So this is just something to think about. We don't have a bill today, but we really need to get our arms around this because things are changing and we need some way to fund Wyoming in the future. And we haven't done very well. And I know my friends disagree with me on the implications of global warming, concerns about the planet, future production of fossil fuels. I absolutely believe it's going to be more and more difficult to produce with fossil fuels, to produce electricity with fossil fuels. And so this is a tool that as these generation sources change, that we can take advantage of the changing landscape, the new types of generation, and the fact that we are going to be a player and get some benefit long-term. And it'll be adaptable. This whole thing about why are we good for renewables? It's because it's just like we're good for minerals. It's literally, it's act of providence, act of God that placed these abundant minerals in Wyoming. And we taxed them, and we've done really good. The world has changed, and we're going to have to leave a lot of those minerals in the ground. But God also provided us with abundant sunshine and wind resources. And in fact, a transmission network developed by our utilities that fits into everybody's needs to ship electricity to the West Coast. So with that, this could be just a way that we kind of looking at the way we tax minerals and taking advantage of the providence of our siting for renewables and other things. It's adaptable as generation methods change. And the next slide, please. We could be supporting our neighbors. Who this is a story from earlier this June, where California begs for more electricity amid a heat wave and their transition to green energy. Just look that story up. It talks about how they're very proud of how they've made substantial progress with respect to moving towards renewables. But it also says they need a little help with electricity. I want to provide them with that help. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to answer any questions.
Chairman Case, just a quick question I have, and then so our biggest producer, Rocky Mountain Power, as you mentioned, they have corporate income taxes in every state that they serve except Wyoming. Is that correct, or is it?
I think that's correct because they don't serve in Nevada.
Right.
And Nevada is the only other state without income tax, Mr.
So
Chairman.
Utah, Idaho, Northern California, Oregon, Washington. Okay, good. Committee, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Case, have you thought about, I mean, we were talking about the struggles that we're having in generation domestically with coal. A lot of that is because of these renewable fuel standards or renewable power standards, electricity standards that were passed by West Coast states. I mean, California, Oregon, Washington State. Those are the big ones. And they violate federal law. Have you thought about how we can levy an annual penalty of, I mean, you could just plug in 300 million, 400 million, or some way of levying a penalty on these states for the damage, in perpetuity that they're posing to our country and to our state.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Gray. I haven't really thought about that specifically. I don't think we could do that. There's all these issues about interstate commerce. States have the right to decide their destiny. States regulate utilities. And the fact is, most of the world and most of the country, I really do believe, supports renewable energy standards, supports, and in fact, there's much more than just the Western states. I believe it's upper 30 states have renewable standards. There might even be more than that by now. Wyoming is one of the few states that doesn't. Our neighbor Utah, for example, doesn't, but there are renewables energy standards at the local level. So I don't think any court would support us. I don't think we have a case. Right now, to the rest of the world, we are the most carbon dependent economy maybe on the planet. I mean, we're right there with Nigeria or something, and I've worked in Nigeria, but we are the outlier. And to think that we're going to prevail by getting them to reverse or to compensate us in a lawsuit, I think is naive. I do think, though, there is a fundamental reason to sell this tax that may impact renewables more than others to our West Coast friends, because I think they care about us and they care about the implications. They know they can't cite large, vast amounts of renewables in Washington and Oregon anymore. They're getting too much pushback. So they understand the consequences that's happening in Wyoming. And I think they would welcome the opportunity to be fair. And, in California, they're paying north of 24 cents for electricity, a tiny amount more to compensate Wyoming for our loss of our landscapes. The vastness of the land used is minuscule to what these people are doing. They'll do it voluntarily. If we impose a tax, they'll pay it.
Okay, any follow-up?
Yeah.
On this?
Thank
Representative
you.
Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Case, why is it that you say it's a 10th Amendment issue that they can pass a renewable fuel standard? Why can they do that? But when the state of Wyoming has a fossil fuel standard that is proposed, we get every single lobbying group crying bloody murder that it violates federal law. I mean, why is their thing okay, but when we try to do a fossil fuel standard every year, that's not okay? And somehow that's violating federal law. Can you explain that to me?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think I've ever said that a fossil fuel standard for Wyoming would violate federal law. I think we can make policy to say we just want to have fossil fueled electricity in Wyoming. I think we can do that. We can write those words on paper. We can write the law. The trouble is it's extremely naive because we can have a big power plant here, but all our power system is built for exporting power. We're not big enough to have internally, 500,000 people is not enough, and spread over this vastness is not enough that we can engineer or economically make our use exclusively fossil fuels. Because I'll tell you, we can't run fossil fuel plants if we don't export. They're just too big. And you need other sources. And everybody else that we export to, especially in the Rocky Mountain Power Territory, they're much greener than us. And they don't want fossil fuels. So we could have the standard, we could do it, it's all legal, but it'd be a bad idea for our ratepayers, and it would be pretty difficult to do in an engineering sense and with an interconnected electric utility.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, and then I'm going to move to public comment on this issue and we're done. Senator James has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Chair, Co-Chair. I was just curious, as far as the coal issue, I know like Representative Gray was saying, what the feds have been doing, restricting their leases and all that kind of stuff. I was just curious if one option has been looked at using Lewiston, Idaho, as they have 2 shipping ports that would definitely allow shipping of coal and anything else that we have, natural gas, oil, and anything that we might else want to ship, since Washington is not wanting to play and also that bankruptcy. Also, it would, if we were to do that, it would promote competition between the 2 railroads that have monopolies on their routes and make it very hard for businesses to thrive as they continue to jack up their shipping prices. So, I mean, I'm just wondering if that has ever been looked at. And also too, this is kind of a big undertaking, but since the federal government is wanting to restrict and make it hard for us to be a thriving economy in Wyoming, how about we look at ways about tactically acquiring BLM land, not to include, the reservations and national parks, but, the BLM land. And along with that, we could take our mineral royalties if those lands are under our possession. So I'm just wondering if those have ever been looked at. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. Let's start with the issue of ports. There are a couple of things we do know. We know that China's coal is kind of expensive. And if you read the stories this week, they're having delivery problems. It's also very dangerous. A lot of people die in Chinese coal mines. So yeah, we're producing most efficiently and most safely the coal in the world. So if we could get it to China, that would be great. But the idea that we can actually take what we produce and run it to China is also kind of on the naive side of the spectrum, because a big port with ships and loading and trains, believe it or not, it could only take maybe a fourth of our production if we could get it from Wyoming to the port. Idaho, trying to clog up the Snake River, I'm not sure that's going to work. But you'd need a major port that would handle 50,000 50 million tons of coal a year. That'd be a fourth of our production. By all accounts, Montana's mines are closer to where a potential port might be. They'll probably benefit if we ever win the port issue. And just a 50 million ton port of coal going out is a big port. You've seen the trains going across Wyoming. Imagine what kind of a port would take to do that. So maybe there'll be some ports, and maybe we'll do the world some good and save some Chinese lives and help them with their chance to empower the country. But it's not going to save Wyoming's coal industry. The railroads, we've talked about the railroads a lot, and it is true. We even did a study one time, Mr. Chairman, of the mineral taxes and whether we could levy more taxes on minerals like coal. And we looked and we found out that the railroads are the key player in that whole thing, and that they are very, very smart, and that their rail rates would, if we lowered our taxes to incentivize production, rails would raise their rates, because the rail companies know exactly how far coal could go and be economic. And so they're very astute at that. Those rail rates are unregulated now because of the Staggers Act, and they enter into contracts with the coal shippers. Whether there's room to reduce those rail rates so that would make it more economical for us to get coal out, I leave that to your imagination, but I suspect there's not a lot of room to go. I think we've attempted as a state various times to acquire the federal lands. I think we've fallen on our swords at each and every time. And even if we did acquire the federal lands with all that coal, if nobody wants to buy the coal or the coal generated electricity from us, what is good is it to have the big pile of coal? The mines will close eventually. The coal will still be in the ground, hundreds of years of coal. Maybe someone will want it later, but it does no good for us to own it if you can't sell it.
Is there any public comment? Folks, and then I'm gonna move to public comment. And any other questions? Okay, and go ahead, follow up, and then I'm going to Representative Jennings. Mine's a short.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you posed a lot of what ifs, but it didn't really answer my question as far as have these options actually been looked at? I mean, especially under what's happening right now, where the federal government is threatening private sector with withholding Medicaid or Medicare funding and all the other threats and the economic impact that they're having. We haven't been in this situation before. So this would be our way of compensating for that and getting them out of our hair. So, and then also too, the rail lines have a connection between North Rock Springs and the old Atlantic City iron ore mine. About 20 miles north to Shoshone is the BNSF. So that would create competition where companies could negotiate with BNSF or UP to ship their product. So while we shouldn't have anything to say on what their rates are, the competition allowed would give the power to the companies to negotiate those rates and make them more competitive with the market.
Okay. Any questions, any comment, then I'll go.
No, I think having more railroads would be a good thing. It doesn't always become perfectly competitive when you have one monopoly and then you add one more person. It doesn't always become perfectly competitive. They kind of act, it's a duopoly, and they both have market power, and maybe we wouldn't get as cheap rates as we did. But if we had more rail connections, that would be good for Wyoming.
Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So mine has, my question to the vice chair or to the co-chair is, I listened to this and I applaud you for the visionary aspect, and I think we all think that renewables are where society is thinking at the moment. I don't know that we know what 10 years will bring, but the part that's a little bit concerning, and I'd like you to address just a little bit for me, is that in this equation, renewables are not there. They cannot produce what consumption is. So if you look to the West Coast or wherever, everybody that wants renewables, it's not available. We cannot produce that much at this point, and not for a while. It's gonna take a while for those to become actually feasible to meet that consumption. And so when I hear your presentation, it seems like to me that one thing that is really missing in here is that they may want that, but it is not feasible at this point in time and won't be for probably decades. And so it seems to me that that gives Wyoming a bargaining chip, if you will. When you come to the table, you look at this and you say, well, we can tax electricity generation and maybe that's one thing on the table. But it looks to me like that we're just throwing up our hands and saying, well, okay, that's what you guys want. And I look at this and I think, listen, you guys can't produce what you're consuming. And so it looks to me like that in Wyoming, at least for part of this discussion, we ought to be able to say, hey, look, we can produce what you want, actually what you need. And for 10 years out, maybe probably 20 years out, it looks to me like that we're taking that off the table ourselves. And we're saying, well, okay, we're going to look at another way to generate electricity. We're going to look at another way to generate income. And so I'd like you to speak to that part a little bit, that, we're 15, 20 years out before renewables are going to get, I for one, hope they get there. But at the moment, they're not. And they're not anytime in the foreseeable future. There's just too much cost. So if you could just address that a little bit.
Go ahead. And then, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Katie, can you go back to the presentation and put up slide number 3 and blow that up? And so I will certainly confess, it's not a confession. I have great concerns about our grid and our future of electricity. I think the Texas event proved that our grid is vulnerable. What you may not realize in this room is that we came closer in our own area, Montana, Wyoming, and north, and really the northeast part of the Western grid was almost there. We were at 97% capacity at the same time that the Texas events happened. Now, folks are replaying all that about whether that was a renewables fault or not. And in fact, some people will very strongly say things like renewables met their expectations in that situation. It was actually gas delivery that fell about. It's kind of a whole mix. We are dramatically changing the way that our world produces electricity. And it's complicated and it's difficult. And it may not be achievable, just like you said. But these coal plants that we are connected to, and if you could blow this up, I want to get at the emissions part, which is in the center of that chart. And just slide it over now. The carbon dioxide is what we're going to look at. This is how much carbon dioxide we produce in Wyoming. So it's in pounds per megawatt hour. And so what that's really saying is, and just slide over just a little bit more because there's a ranking right there. We produce more carbon dioxide to produce our electricity than anybody else in the country. I hear you, that's great. The truth is our customers don't want electricity produced with carbon dioxide. And states have committed to this. And they are absorbing enormous costs to get there, and enormous costs that will come farther down the road, because they view the costs of carbon dioxide and global warming as being even more enormous. The consequences of sea level rise, the consequences of, just tell you in Lander, I'll tell you about Lander. Used to be that we had maybe 12 or 14 days in the summer that is above 90 degrees. Okay. 45 days above 90 degrees, several above over 95 now, the tripling. I've lived in the same house all my life. We've always had a garden. You could never plant a garden before the 1st of June, ever. You better have your garden all picked by the 1st of September, certainly by the 5th of September, because it's going to be froze. You can plant your garden in early May now. And you might get a light frost, you might not, but you can pretty much run that risk. It's about the same risk we used to have at the 1st of May or 1st of June. We just got our first frost in September, like last week. The planet is changing, whether it's the fault of that number one emissions of coal or not, carbon. We're target number one. The rest of the world doesn't want what we're selling. We can sit on the highest stack of coal and talk about how valuable it is, and it's worth zero in our future. Even though it's unworkable, our grid needs work, our energy, our transitions are poorly thought out. Every one of those coal plants shutting down prematurely, all kind of a bad policy. But this is the crisis. The sky is falling. Everybody that's elected is talking about how the sky is falling. We're the victims of that. We need to be adaptable, and that irregardless of the generation source, we make sure that Wyoming is protected. We can build roads, we can build schools, and we can operate this great state. That's what I'm trying to do with this. That's the vision I'm trying to give you.
I think, and I just comment, Mr. Co-Chair, I think this isn't, to me, has nothing to do with all this crazy politics outside Wyoming. It really doesn't. I think what you're trying to do is really future-proof. Because really, how do we tax the generation of electricity now?
We don't.
Well, really severance and maybe a wind generation tax. And so this proposal that you said would give full credit to anybody who already pays those taxes. And I think if, and when you talk to the leaders of these corporations, they would much rather have a corporate kind of tax like every other state that they serve, because then they can account for that and the whole thing. But I think the part where you give credits, I think, is really important. Make sure everybody has their oars in the water. That's how I understand this. Regardless, hey, maybe 50 years from now, everybody realizes and technology's changed. We go get Wyoming's coal, another 500 years of Wyoming's coal. But I think the key part that you're saying is, just less than 15 years ago, it was about 40% of our electricity generated by coal. Now it's 20%. Something's changed. So what else generates? Natural gas is a huge part. There's no doubt, and they pay severance. But there's also another huge part that didn't even exist. And I think that's how I see it. Hey, we can't control all this crazy, but we all know where we're at on this. Hey, I'm the guy that first started the Coal Port Litigation Fund. I mean, we've tried it. There is some good news on natural gas exports. I think there is. And we got to keep fighting for Wyoming's coal, because we know just burning Wyoming's coal in China cleans the planet. It's cleaner coal. We know that.
Safer workers.
Safer workers. It's better for the whole world as we transition or whatever happens. But man, we can't control all that. We can only do what we can do. But I think this part of having everybody's oars in the water and giving credit to those folks who already are rowing the boat, it's not going to change their world at all. They're going to keep their fight up for what they're doing. That's the part of this. Sometimes I think we've gotten distracted here by debating national and international policies, which we are almost probably universally in agreement with here in Wyoming. To me, that's not this bill at all. It's trying to recognize the world's changing a little bit, and make sure that those folks who are changing it continue to help pay in Wyoming. And then last comment I'll just say is every state tries to export their taxes. Every state does. Wyoming's been genius at it. Severance taxes, for the most part, have been non-Wyoming corporated. There's certainly some, but we've been really genius at it. The folks and Governor Hathaway didn't support it at first. When he did, he was chastised and booed by many, but in the end, you know, it was really, really a huge deal. So, but anyway, so that's how I see this. I think we're getting distracted a little bit with all this other talk, but I think it's more about making sure everybody's doing their fair share on this thing for Wyoming. But okay, anyway,
Yes.
thanks. That's my comments. Representative Sweeney.
Just quickly, Mr. Chairman. So Representative Jennings said something that kind of hit home to me. So how these utilities, Rocky Mountain Power, really, how do we actually have control over their destiny? I mean, a lot of the talk is like Wyoming owns the utility, which we don't. And yes, we have a little bit of control versus the Public Service Commission over some of the power generation. But in your thought process, and beautiful presentation, Senator Case, good thought process and a lot of information. Wow. But do you have some thoughts on, I mean, do we have control over these private companies to that degree? I would like to think that we have some control, but in your estimation, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's go, Chair.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Utilities are regulated by the Wyoming Public Service Commission. We also have environmental regulation of their energy production, but we kind of share the overall burden. That ratio of 85% to 15% is the ratio of consumption of Wyoming versus the rest of the Rocky Mountain Power Territory. So we enter into a joint planning arrangement with the other states because we have to be consistent about how we manage this multi-state utility. You know, and I suppose we could nationalize them or make them divest so that we only have a utility that serves Wyoming. But all the plants and all the transmission line, they're not just designed for Wyoming, they're designed for 5 states. And we roughly influence them by about 15% of the 100% total, because that's the amount of rates we control. That's about the cost that we allow for their recovery. We can't tell them what to do in Washington and Oregon with the rest of the utility. We jointly agree on a planning process. And let me say that jointly agreed planning process called the Integrated Resource Plan. Their plans are not to keep the coal plants running. Their plans are to move towards renewables, to bridge it with gas, and to move forward. Rocky Mountain Power, in terms of this tax, they'll have options. They can extend the same consideration we're thinking of giving to industrial customers to their large customers throughout their system. That'll be up to those utility corporate regulators and the company. So they'll have options to deal with the tax, but the tax is on the production of energy here, which means it's going to be paid for, and it's perfectly legal, and it follows the Commerce Clause, and we can do this to tax people in other states, which is wonderful, and also realizes the impacts they're creating in our state.
When we exhaust our questions here, we're going to go to public break. We're going to go to break and then come back with public comment. Okay. I think Representative Hallinan and then Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems like this argument is all geared towards setting up an electricity production tax. Well, I say a better approach to this is a wind energy production tax. That's what that's what California wants. They want wind energy. Well, let's let them pay for it. Why don't we charge more for the wind energy that we produce? That seems to make better sense to me than just having a general electricity production tax. Have a wind energy production tax. That's where these companies make their money. And that's what California wants, is wind energy and solar energy. Tax that also. It seems more appropriate to address this to the demand. The demand is for those two products. So why don't we charge the appropriate fees for the production of those taxes? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Co-Chair.
Katie, can you get up to slide 6? I just refer to slide 6. I think the future is not just about wind. Increasingly, we're going to have solar, which doesn't, wind pays a dollar per megawatt hour tax, which would be a deductible tax in this whole thing, right? Solar doesn't pay that tax. They just pay property and sales tax like everything else. We haven't even thought about how we're going to tax that nuclear power plant. Right now, they build a plant, they would pay property and sales tax. They might get the manufacturing tax exemption. They might, if they somehow as their connection to Wyoming fuel, they might pay some severance, but I don't know. Pumped hydro, geothermal. How are we going to take advantage of that? And I think that's kind of the blend is the real future of what's really going to happen. So, you know what, we pick on one technology. I've been raked over the coals for that, and good doctor, I have tried and tried and tried. So I think this is a fairer approach and more realistic of the generation options in the future.
And then I think next was Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go back to the philosophical side of this, that because I didn't feel like we quite went there. I applaud the co-chairman for being visionary, and I think there's some merit to being visionary, but I just don't see for the next 10 to 20 years, you know, it's like this argument says the only answer is to tax. And I understand we've had issues in how we've handled the debate over some of these things, but this feels like that we're throwing in the towel to supply and demand. And demand is huge. It's huge, and they cannot supply that with renewables at this point. It seems to me that at this point, and for the foreseeable future of 10 to 20 years, you know, I mean, you're saying that we're going to shut coal down, maybe, probably, to our own harm, but we're going to change a lot of that over to natural gas production for electricity. And I think that's a good way. I mean, it looks to me like we've probably lost some of this argument. I'm not sure that we're going to lose it all, but it looks like it puts us in the driver's seat, because we still, natural gas or coal, we have the supply and they have the demand. That puts us in the driver's seat for the negotiations in the foreseeable future of 10 to 20 years. And it just looks to me like, instead of always looking at tax, it looks like that we throw that off the table, that supply and demand in a free market is still the driving factor here. And so while I'm grateful for the visionary aspect, it just seems to me like we broaden it and say, taxes aren't the only thing. We are the supplier, whether it's coal, natural gas, nuclear, whatever it is. Like you've stated, Wyoming has been blessed with this opportunity. And it looks to me like we're taking that off the table. So in a free market, it feels like that we're taking something that's very good for us to be in the driver's seat. And we should be able to say to the people that want that have the demand say, you know what, we're not there yet. We can't build enough wind farms. We can't build enough solar farms. So your supply is going to go away if that's the only thing you want. And I think that we should come to the table and say, you know what, we can produce the supply. I mean, can we do it cleaner? Sure. Let's go to natural gas. Let's change some of those nuclear. Maybe there's some real answers out there. But in the meantime, we got 10, 15, 20 years where we can still say, hey, this is what it's going to be. If you want to meet your demand, we have the supply. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Mr. Co-Chair.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just beg to disagree. So 10 years ago, you're talking about a timeline of 10 or 15 years ago, or 10 to 15 years into the future, saying we're going to be able to sell the coal and sell the, let's just look what's happened to coal in the past 10 years. 10 years ago, in 2010, even as late as 2012, we produced over 400 million tons of coal. And for that, we got about 6%, all the value of that coal, we got a 6% severance fee, and we got about the same in ad valorem, maybe 12 or 13% of the value of that coal came to Wyoming. Today, we're producing less than half in only 8 years, less than half. What will 8 more years bring? What will 10 more years bring? It's going to go down. I'm not even counting, Mr. Chairman, the coal lease bonuses. And they've gone from building every school in Wyoming to zero, because no one's planning. And if no one's planning to mine coal in the future, it ain't going to happen. And the sleeper in all this is natural gas. And it's true. We wouldn't have gone this far without natural gas. Where's Wyoming going to be with respect to selling natural gas? The trouble with natural gas is everybody's got it. We used to have, when Jonah Field came in, it was going to produce 2% of the nation's natural gas needs for 50 years. 2% doesn't sound like much, but 2% of America from one field in Wyoming. Now everybody's got fields like Jonah, or nearly so. They're not going to take Wyoming gas to produce that. We're not going to get Wyoming revenue for that. And you know what's going to happen with natural gas? All the oil plays are horizontal well drilling now. And there's a lot of associated gas with that. That means we produce a lot of gas. What does that mean? It means that prices are in the tank, so that the prognosis is low gas prices, which isn't good for these coffers. It'll never build the schools that we had. It'll never, can you imagine, you just pick the price of coal. Say it's $20 times 400 million tons. And we got 12% of that. Wow. Now it's less than half in 8 years. You tell me what the future brings. We have to be prepared for the new world.
Okay, any other questions? Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Case, you have a conceptual question for you too, is that one of the things that's troubled me on this, so we hear that states have the ability, the 10th Amendment ability to set these renewable fuel standards. Well, through the Public Service Commission, we should have the ability to refuse to cite a transmission line to feed that demand. And every time I've mentioned that, it's been, do you think that we have the ability to refuse to cite a transmission line to feed that renewable fuel standard? The Public Service Commission has that ability.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you drive from Rock Springs or from Rollins to Laramie, you will see the transmission line that's going to make everything happen. It's already built. Whether we could have refused it or made a deal or not, it's in. So that's the Gateway West project. There's another big project being worked then. The hitch seems to be mostly in Colorado. We don't have anything to do with that. Yes, I'm sure we could have beat our chests and said, we're not going to let you build a transmission line. But unless we get some kind of a deal for you to buy other energy or charge higher rates or whatever. But why would we do that? We're desperate to build pipelines and transmission lines to get our energy production out of the state. We bend over backwards to do that because we want to sell stuff. So I can't even imagine that we would restrict transmission lines. We've had bills in the past to restrict the feeder lines, the use of eminent domain for feeder lines for independent energy power projects. At one time, there was a moratorium on that. So you couldn't use, not a utility, but an independent power project could not condemn land for a transmission line. That moratorium went off and efforts to extend the moratorium, which I was part of, failed. So maybe you're right, Representative Gray. Maybe there is a theoretical, we have that power, but we're not using the power. We don't want to use the power. We want transmission. And the bottom line is it's already built.
Representative Gray.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I just
Follow-up?
want to clarify, we want fossil fuel transmission. That's what we want. So if we had, clarified that, that's what they're basically doing by having renewable transmission line is the PSC is hurt ourselves. I mean, it makes no sense to me why that wasn't discussed at that time and why future ones aren't being discussed. It's nonsensical to me.
Mr.
Hey,
Chairman,
Mr. Coach.
it doesn't make a lot of sense to call a transmission line a renewable line or a fossil fuel line. They just move electrons. And we need transmission lines, just like we need pipelines. And so the question is, where are those electrons going to be produced? I'm talking about looking at the big picture in Wyoming's future. A transmission line is just totally neutral with respect to where the generation comes from. And they're good. Our nation needs better transmission. If we're going to be able to adapt to more renewables in the grid, having better transmission and more capabilities is part of that equation because it'll allow for the geographic diversity of wind that might be produced even in another grid to be used those transmission lines. That's better for the country. A lack of transmission is worse. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator James got maybe one final comment here, and we're gonna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I do actually have a suggestion that would let us have our cake and eat it too. And also benefit coal, oil, gas, wind, and solar. Put them all on that equal playing field that they've been wanting. So my suggestion is that we take away that severance tax and instead turn it into a usage fee, kind of like what the co-chair was talking about. But what we do is to make this plan work, we would have to convert all the forms of energy into a BTU. And then we charge accordingly as they cross the state line. And from there, we would be able to have them all charged the same, and it would also, that's how we'd be able to charge the customers in other states. We'd have different categories, residential, commercial, and industrial, of course, different rates, and that right there would accomplish what the co-chair is trying to accomplish without coming up with a new tax or raising taxes or whatever else this committee has a tendency to do. So I think that we would do that. And of course, we keep those rates for the people within Wyoming as well. So that way we don't violate any trade laws.
Okay, members, any other? Okay, members of the public, appreciate you hanging with us, and we are going to take a break. we'll just come back and start right up at 11 o'clock and we'll open up with public comment. So thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, that clock's 11 o'clock is 5 minutes fast, so. It's oil and gas commission time.
Okay, I'm gonna work off of, gonna work off your cell phone time. So let's come back at 5 minutes till.
Okay.
5 minutes till 11. please.
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, I want to correct one thing, and thank you, staff, and thanks for other friends here. When when David Miller, who sadly just recently lost his wife, when he was in the legislature, he had a bill about nuclear power, and he put in a $5 per megawatt hour tax on nuclear power. There's a threshold limit. It was designed to be for bigger plants and to not apply to smaller plants. My understanding is that the current proposal, they're coming in with an idea to raise that limit so that the Buffett Gates proposal is not going to qualify for the tax. But I said it wasn't taxed. I think on the books, we theoretically have a tax. Want to be sure that I'd be correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Co-Chair. We're going to move to public comment on this issue. Is there any folks here would like to comment on this? Yeah, please come forward. Just identify yourself, who you represent, where you're from. And we're really glad you're here and like to hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be here today, and hello to the members of the committee that are joining online. My name is Kara Choquette. I work for the Anschutz Corporation and for two companies that are part of the Anschutz Corporation. One is Power Company of Wyoming, developing a large wind project south of Rollins, and the other is Transwest Express, developing a large transmission line to connect Wyoming to new markets. And I just wanted to comment on a couple of things that were said earlier and address some questions from the committee, if that's okay.
Sure.
The first thing I wanted to mention is that our projects in no way compete with Powder River Basin coal. I wanted to assure you of that. We've specifically targeted markets in Southern California that are not buying Wyoming coal today, and nor will they in the future. What we're trying to do is create a whole new market for Wyoming to the desert Southwest and sell a product that the market has indicated they're interested in, which is renewable energy. So whether a project lives or dies does not affect the markets in the Powder River Basin. So I just wanted to assure you of that. I also wanted to point out, it's a great conversation about technology choice, wind, solar, offshore wind, geothermal. All of these are choices, and that technology choice has also brought about market choice. And I talked to this committee in August, and again, briefly highlighted that to the Revenue Committee, the House Revenue Committee in March, that there is a lot of opportunity to generate electricity in states other than Wyoming. So we took a look at wind and solar projects that had been selected in 2019 and 2020 around Wyoming. There are about 20 different wind and solar projects that had been selected by the main rate regulated utilities and the wholesale generation and transmission providers, all outside of Wyoming. And the resource is not the driving factor either. And we showed the data that these 20 projects are often located in places with equal to perhaps or worse wind and solar resources than what are available in Wyoming. So it's not just the resource that drives the decision making. Regarding California, again, this was something I had talked about in August. California is a market we're trying to crack open for Wyoming. Southern California, Arizona, Nevada are not buying electricity supplies from Wyoming today, but that's what we're working to make happen, is to bring an entirely new market, as I said, to Wyoming in the form of renewable energy. Our projects, if they can be successful in Wyoming, represent a $6 billion investment in the state and over $850 million in property taxes, sales and use taxes, and the generation tax revenue to Wyoming. In addition, we also will pay the business license tax, which is about $200,000 for every $1 billion of assets that are located in the state. So we do believe that we have a lot of oars in the water, happy to have those oars in the water and try to bring that diverse source of revenue and jobs to Wyoming. One other point I wanted to make about costs and transmission is that that is a really big factor for a project like ours. Let me step back a little bit too and say there's been a lot of discussion about the rate regulated utility business model, but there are a lot of us who are operating in the energy ecosystem outside of that rate regulated utility model. We're independent wind, we're independent transmission, and therefore we have to be selected by the market if our projects can go forward. So that's why price is so important to us. And I would, really urge the committee to consider carefully before another tax might be imposed on electricity product that, again, can be sourced from other states. And we're seeing that going forward in other states as well. transmission has a cost, and that's just unfortunately a disadvantage for Wyoming in a lot of different aspects of energy. Is we talked about railroads, getting that electricity to the market has a cost. So I just wanted to make those points. Oh, sorry. One other thing that came up is the idea that corporate income tax makes a difference. And that analysis was actually done in 2017 and presented to the Revenue Committee, where we looked at a nominal 3,000 megawatt wind project in Wyoming under the property tax, sales and use tax, generation tax, totality of the taxes. Wyoming wind project would pay about $841 million in state taxes, where the same project, if the Nevada tax regime were applied, would pay about $421 million. So half of what the taxes would be in Wyoming. So the corporate income tax, as demonstrated in our analysis, but also the University of Wyoming analysis in 2016 and 2019 showed that the corporate income tax is not necessarily a factor in making projects more or less competitive. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, I'm looking around. Anyone? Representative Yen? Okay, and then I'll go Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, you know, I think the electricity generation tax really made no sense at the time. And that's why I voted against the solar version of it that came through the House last year. I do think a gross receipts tax, though, makes more sense because the value of a kilowatt hour may vary depending on when you generate it, et cetera. So what would you say about the idea of the gross receipts tax as a replacement for the generation tax, especially given that it would be energy type neutral rather than, you know, specific to each? We have one for two different types of energy generation now rather than an across the board electricity gross receipts tax. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for the question, Representative Yen. I think that would be hard to say right now without having the chance to have evaluated what is the proposal. So the gross receipts tax concept was just presented here. I think it's a little confusing when I think there was a gross receipts type tax talked about yesterday that would apply to all companies and industries. So would this be in addition to or separate from? And then looking at the rate at which that would be set could certainly affect. And so should that be applied at a rate that might actually be a higher tax regime than what we pay right now? So it's hard to say without having the chance to do that analysis.
Okay. Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions, Ms. Choquette. Currently, for Southern California, how are they achieving their generation? Like what's the sourcing? You said that right now 0% is from Wyoming. And what is your goal? What do you think you could achieve? What percentage of Southern Californians? And what does that mean? Is that like south of Santa Barbara? I just don't understand, you know, what does that mean? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you. That's a great question. I really appreciate that question. So Southern California, Arizona, and Nevada is where we're targeting to sell electricity from this project. So a lot of those states are getting their electricity from solar. That's a really well-supported industry in that area. The state of California has had entities that have signed power purchase agreements with wind farms in New Mexico. We talked a lot about the advantages that New Mexico has certainly in its tax structure. They have, of course, their existing fleet of wind and solar, and increasingly California is looking at battery storage and offshore. So offshore wind has a really high capacity factor. It's also, you know, something that the state is really supporting. So right now it's a combination of wind, solar, geothermal, battery storage, and a future where they're looking at offshore wind as well. So we do everything we can to tell them, here's why you should choose wind energy from Wyoming, the diversity, the way it complements their system, and really trying to show the value proposition of what we can offer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Choquette, what do you what is the percentage right now in Southern California of natural gas and coal?
Mr. Chairman? Yeah.
I'm kind of looking for that too. I'm searching. Go ahead.
Representative Gray, I don't know the percentage right now of coal. I know that a lot of coal right now comes from the Intermountain Power System in south central Utah, but the state has decided to not buy coal electricity from the Intermountain Power Plant after 2025. I've been told by the Wyoming Energy Authority, or previously the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, that California sources about 1/3 of its natural gas supplies from Wyoming into California. That was several years ago. I'm not sure if that number is still the same. But one of the things we hope is certainly, wind energy is what will help get that transmission pathway built today, and what will be the source, or will deliver wind energy. That's what the market wants now. But then we'll have that transmission infrastructure there to be able to deliver the resources of the future. And what does that look like? It could be the carbon capture, natural gas, those other resources that could come on the line. So transmission is a long life asset. The transmission built from Hoover Dam is still delivering power to LA today. So wind might be what we're selling today, but there's opportunity then to reach that market with other resources tomorrow.
Okay, I'm finished. Okay, Representative James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious, we had talked previously about the usage fee idea, and I was just curious what your thoughts and how that would work with your industry and how that would work in general, just from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Again, I think it would be hard without seeing an actual proposal and doing the economic analysis. One thing I think would be a little bit challenging is converting a non-BTU source of electricity like wind or solar to BTUs, and then what assumptions you would use and what assumptions you would base that on. I know that was a challenge back in 2016. The issue came up of, how much does wind and pay per megawatt hour compared to coal and oil and natural gas, and the LSO came up with some assumptions that for 8,000 BTU coal at $15 a ton, that all taxes paid to Wyoming was $1.77 per megawatt hour. For gas at a price of $2.85 per MCF, all taxes paid to Wyoming was $3.49 per megawatt hour, but there was some, complicated assumptions that went into that. Wind, when you consider the full burden of property sales and generation tax, we calculated paying $3.91 and Wyoming imposed taxes per megawatt hour. So I think a lot of it would probably depend on the assumptions and who sets the assumptions and how that goes forward, as well as examining, I'm sure I'm not a lawyer either, the constitutionality of having that tax rate applied to in-state and out-of-state electricity users.
Okay, anyone else? Any other questions? Okay. Representative Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Carrick, I know in the past, or you've told us that you don't have any power purchase agreements yet with the end receivers. And I'm just wondering, we're trying to figure out what room Wyoming has to tax wind generation. Is there anything that would help, let's just say, the wind industry have some surety that we could do? Trying to figure out how to make this a question. Make it workable. It would give you some surety, and it would also give us a starting point, because this is a new thing for Wyoming to be generating and transmitting power to out of state. Could you help me with that? Thank you.
I think, thank you for the question. I think it's, what could the state do to make Wyoming wind more competitive? Is that, or more certain? I think actually what's been very helpful, that since this issue was first come up in May of 2016, is the legislative committees have always listened to all of the facts and always decided to leave the taxation of wind energy at the current level. That has established certainty, and the fact that the tax has not been raised in the past several years that this issue has been brought up. So I do appreciate that, and the work that the various committees have done over the years and listened to the facts from industry and kept that the same. I would also say I like the ideas that you had in the industrial revenue bond presentation. Our project, I think, is too big to qualify for something like that. But that's the kind of creative thinking I think that could be helpful to others potentially in the industry.
I think for those narrow federal allotment of 300 million, but I think we could certainly go more than that if we wanted to on the bonding. But I think one thing though on the wind tax proposal the last several years, I think they've all passed committee. They've died in the process, either. I think they've all passed out of this committee.
The subject, Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman, has
Yeah.
been discussed many times at the committee.
Okay, very good. Any other questions? Oh, okay, Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Choquette, California this year had a serious problem with the blackout. They ran out of electricity. How much of that was due to the fact that they don't use very much of their, they don't use very much electricity from fossil fuels? Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hallen, thank you for the question. I'm not sure how much of it was related to fossil fuels. Like as in Texas, it's a grid issue. A lot of the electricity being generated locally then prevents the benefits of geographic diversity. So you've made a great statement in support of one of the things we say is why they should choose wind energy from Wyoming is we provide that geographic diversity. So if the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing in California, the wind is probably blowing pretty well in Wyoming. And we potentially then have the opportunity as well to do natural gas as a firming and shaping resource at our site as well. So the greater connectivity to the grid, as you talked a little bit about earlier, is very helpful in making sure that resources can be moved around as well. But the Transwest project is really designed to help provide that resilience and backbone across the whole Western power grid. No one has built transmission line like this in decades because it is different from the rate regulated utility model. The risks are higher, but there's certainly a lot of grid benefits in providing access to other generation across the West.
Okay. Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, there were some questions about power generation in California, and I just looked up the EIA data on that. From 2019, the power generated in California, 42.5% came from natural gas, 14% from solar, 6.8% from wind, 8% from nuclear, 19% from hydroelectric power. And those percentages I just gave you make up 90% of what California generated in 2019.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could
Go
add
ahead.
just one more point, referencing the memo that LSO had put together about electricity taxes in other states. The committee has heard from the University of Wyoming, as I mentioned, in 2016 and 2019. And it's interesting that in Nevada, they specifically exempt from corporate or business taxes any revenues from power exported from the state would be exempt. So it's kind of the opposite idea that in Nevada, they specifically look to have less taxes on power that's exported.
Okay, members, any other questions? Well, thank you so much for your testimony today and answering the questions. Sure
Thank you for the
appreciate
opportunity. I
being here.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, any other members of the public? You'd like to come up? I don't see mad rush. Okay, are there any public comment online? Okay, can you hear us? Mr. Darren, can you hear us?
Oh, yes, I apologize. I was just getting transferred over into the
Yeah,
Zoom.
no, it's perfect. We can hear you. Go ahead and introduce yourself, who you represent.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Tom Darren, and I represent the American Clean Power Association, and I'm our Director of Western State Affairs. The American Clean Power Association is the multi-tech version of what used to be the American Wind Energy Association. And starting this year, we are, as I said, now multi-clean technology, focusing on representing the utility scale wind, solar, storage, and transmission developers across the country, including at least 10 or so companies very focused on the Wyoming market. In full disclosure, just so you know, Power Company of Wyoming and Transwest are members of American Clean Power, and appreciate Ms. Choquette's earlier comments. Just have a few opening comments and then maybe two things in quick response. Kara covered a lot of good points, and I don't want to duplicate what she said. The renewable energy opportunity with all three, actually all four, wind, solar, storage, and transmission are a fantastic opportunity to address what Chairman Case was talking about in his opening slide deck, that we're already contributing to some of the revenue shortfalls that were covered there. We pay 3 separate taxes: the wind generation tax that was mentioned, sales and use tax, and property taxes. We're the only state in the country that has all 3. There are 2 other states that do have a wind generation tax, but they do that in lieu of one of the others I mentioned. Just last year, those taxes contributed $31 million to the state of Wyoming at both state and local level combined. The consensus revenue estimate group, the Craig group in Wyoming, in their most recent report, found a bright spot where there were a lot of declining revenues, that on the sales and use taxes, the largest revenue contributor to the general fund, they found that that beat their forecast by about $35 million, or about an 8% uptick increase. And 2 factors: one were the stimulus payments, but the other was wind in the state, and a lot of wind activity. So I just wanted to point that out. Just here today to say that that Wyoming really needs to stay competitive, like Ms. Choquette mentioned, to capture both the localized market with Rocky Mountain Power and the broader regional market. And here to say that adding a 4th tax would make us uncompetitive with equal resources in some cases for wind, in some cases better solar resources in other states. And then to some of the comments earlier, I just have two concluding points. Chairman Case talked about the Rocky Mountain Power and the amount of their generation that's consumed in Wyoming. I just want to point out that the Energy Information Administration from DOE, Senator Case, I think we're probably in agreement with this if we look at the broader, not just Rocky Mountain Power, which has the bulk of the load in the state, but about 35 to 40% of all electricity produced in Wyoming is actually consumed in Wyoming. So if you increase the taxes, I just want to point out, first and foremost, you're going to increase the cost and the rates paid by some fair percentage of Wyoming residents. And then to the other point about focusing on the industrial load, I'm not sure that's in the best interest of Wyoming. You're all in charge of that. But if we increase the burden and the tax rate on industrial consumers, both present and possible in the future in Wyoming, we may detract what Wyoming's trying to do, which is bring more of those companies in to manufacture and do business in the state of Wyoming. So I just wanted to point that out. That's EIA data. And then lastly on this, the concept of exporting taxes. There's that localized market and the broader regional market that Ms. Choquette spoke to. And yes, the markets are big eventually in California. My team, again, I work in the Western region. American Clean Power has an entire team in Sacramento that for the last 6-7 years has been working on just what has been talked about here today, to open up the markets to Wyoming and other wind in the Western interconnection. There are a lot of labor forces and other political forces in California that are trying to keep their generation in state. And that has led to a lot of solar and storage procurement over the past 3 to 5 years, and maybe a couple of power purchase agreements with wind projects in New Mexico. We are working. I just want folks in this committee to know that my industry is working to promote Wyoming and other wind, but Wyoming wind and Wyoming economic development opportunities to these markets. They're just not. We view that that's going to change. That can't last forever. They're going to need generation from lots of different states. So all I'm saying here is keep Wyoming competitive, because that's about to happen. And when they mean the utilities or the load serving entities in California, go out and solicit new resources, wind and solar and storage, there's going to be competitive across the Western United States. So Wyoming needs to have its generation, both wind and solar, priced very competitively so that it'll win in competitive solicitations. Those are called requests for proposals. So that opportunity is out there, but Wyoming needs to be careful, because if it's not competitive, the PPA, the power purchase agreement, might go to a project in a different state, and that state will get the economic development, will get the taxes, and to the extent that taxes are exported, that state will export its taxes to California, not Wyoming. So it's not as easy just to say we raise the taxes and some other set of ratepayers in some other state pays them. I just wanted to point that out. With that, I really appreciate the opportunity to participate and virtually today. I'm committing to the next time, I probably will be in Cheyenne, right? To seeing you in person. And I'll take any questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Darren. Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Darren, I'm curious, just from your perspective, what are sort of the reasons why these West Coast states are blocking a siting of a coal export terminal? Do you have any ideas how we can talk to these people? Because I know you probably talk to them a lot and agree with them on a lot of things. Is there any is there any way to get through to the folks that are denying this? Try to reason with them, or is it just, you know, they've made up their minds and we're going to have to continue to pursue the constitutional challenge because it is unconstitutional, and use other pieces of leverage that we have? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and Mr. Darren will
Yeah.
work to that topic a
Thank
little
you.
bit again.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead.
Representative. Sorry, if you can still hear me, Representative Gray.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Just to clarify, are we talking about coal as a fuel source export to foreign buyers? Or are we talking about coal,
Yes,
electricity on
yes,
wires?
I think
Yes.
we got a little off your presentation there, but maybe that's when
It's
you
it's
guys
not really
can
off
talk
his
about
I
over
mean,
lunch.
he comes
Well,
from that
Mr.
perspective.
Chairman,
I think we'll just,
I'm not sure what this has to do with Mr. Darren's presentation.
Yeah.
This is about,
I mean.
this is
he's
about
not an
not
expert
coal on
on
wires,
coal
right?
ports,
yeah,
and
okay, how about
where's this
everybody
going?
just calm down a minute?
Hold
We're
on,
gonna-
hold on.
Hold on a minute.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, everybody just stop. Stop talking for a minute. Thank you. Now, I would like to keep these questions on to Mr. Darren's presentation. I don't think he brought one point about coal exports. And so I'm going to move to the next question. That's going to be Representative Sweeney. Go ahead.
Can you ask a question based on something?
Go ahead. Okay, so any other questions then on this presentation? Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Darren. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
And any
Appreciate
final
it.
comments? Okay, very good. Thank you. Is there any other public comment? Okay, very good. Okay, members, are there any direction to staff on this topic? Anybody? Okay. Oh, Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I would say that it shouldn't, we shouldn't be favoring any power generation source over another. We should be trying to export as much energy outside of Wyoming as we can. And regardless of the type of energy that is, the idea that we would try to limit the amount of energy that we export out of Wyoming seems insane to me. And I think the gross receipts tax is just to make sure that there is an even playing field and that we're not trying to put our hand on the scale for anything in particular. So I do think I'm in support of this gross receipts idea. I don't think it makes sense for us to pass both a corporate gross receipts tax and then an electricity generation gross receipts tax. But I do think it makes sense for us to have both options on the table. So I'll make a motion for a gross receipts tax on electricity generation that exempts, that allows for one-for-one credit with severance tax. And also in the bill, I think it just makes sense to remove both of the energy production excise taxes. So the two that we have, just so we have this even field for how we tax electricity generation. And that would be my motion, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, is there a second? Okay, it's been seconded. Okay, discussion.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So property tax would be part of the formula on the gross receipts tax, on the gross receipts. That's part of the equation, or how do you see that working?
Mr. Chairman, I am amenable if my second is to including a deduction on property taxes.
Okay. Any further questions, discussion? Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm against doing away with the excise tax that I think currently applies to coal, or not to coal, but to wind generation. I think the wind generation has the biggest cause of our problems with exporting energy out of the state of Wyoming in terms of coal and fossil fuels. And I think we need to keep that in place. In fact, I think we need to increase that excise tax. So I would be against this motion if that is part of the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Senator Case.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just in terms of moving the concept forward, I mean, there can be a staff comment and we can have it one way or the other and have options. I'm not, if it's a 1-for-1 offset, it doesn't matter whether one's in or not, if it's picked up on the other side. So maybe we could just kind of meet in the middle and have a bill draft and just look at options, you know.
Okay.
It's not saying it has to be one way or the other.
Okay, very good. Any other discussion on this motion?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to consider the message that we're sending, not just in Wyoming, but outside of Wyoming. And in terms of what we've already agreed to as a committee regarding taxes on services and the corporate thing and whatnot, I think you start getting into where you're pushing, maybe promoting unintended consequences. Yeah. And so I would resist this motion. It could certainly come up in the form of a private bill for purposes of continuing the discussion. Really appreciate the excellent summary provided by the co-chairman. There's a lot for us to digest in there. We just stood up a Wyoming Energy Authority, and they're still getting their feet underneath themselves and getting organized and developing their overall strategy going forward. So I would resist this, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Other members, any other discussion before we Representative Roscoe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The reason I second this motion, and I think would be good for the committee to have something to compare, to have this gross receipt idea compared to a generation tax. And I think it would just help Wyoming move along in making this decision. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other members? Okay, since you're
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sweeney.
I propose an amendment.
Okay.
To also include property tax into the proposed bill.
Okay, so we have an amendment to this proposal. Okay, any discussion on adding property tax to that? Okay.
Is that friendly?
I think that's almost friendly, but I'll ask the sponsor.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I think it is friendly if my second is.
Okay, so we're on the original motion. Okay, since you're ready to vote on this, request to sponsor a bill for our next meeting. It's all the draft a bill. No means to sponsor at that point. Okay. All those in favor, raise your hand. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Anybody online? Okay, all those opposed, raise your hand. Okay, 1, 2, 3 online. 8, 9. So that motion has failed. Okay, any other issues on, any other proposals on this issue? Okay, I think, okay, Representative James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would like to propose a bill draft for my usage fee idea. And that way we could talk to the industries that it'll be affecting and narrow it down and make it equal across the board. And that way we can make sure that there are no extra taxes. However, this would bring in a lot of revenue if implemented. And we got to make sure that we also put in there that we'll be replacing the severance tax. So it's not an additional tax. It's just making sure that the people outside of Wyoming are paying their fair share as well. So I'd like a bill draft on that, please.
Okay, is there a second? Anyone online? Okay, motion fails for lack of a second. Okay, are there any other motions on this for directions of staff? Okay, so folks, I think we're going to, it's 11:35. So why don't we take an early lunch, come back at 12:30, but is there any other items before the committee before we break? Mr. Co-Chair?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Huxtable is here from Converse County, and there is another utility tax issue regarding state assessed property, that it's electric utility plant, and how county assessors play a role in that or not. And I don't know if this would be an appropriate time since we're early, but that is a
Might as
significant
well, let's
issue.
go. That'd be great.
And I don't mean, I didn't, I know she knows the issue, and I think the Department of Revenue
Be
knows
good
the
to
issue.
educate the committee, all right. Very good.
Mr. Chairman, are we going to go through this one also, the briefing on electricity landscape?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think that's
Okay.
just committee information.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Dixie Huxtable, Converse County Assessor. And thank you for the invite to discuss the issues with the state assessed valuation for wind farms. We are still working on that prospect. I can tell you that from my county, I have some new facilities. We have been working with the new companies as well as some of the established companies to get information to tie back to the Department of Revenue's state assessed property. As you know, there's some confidentiality issues. We ask for the annual reports that are submitted to the state. I will tell you that I did get them all this year. I have not even had time to go through them. Some were several hundred pages. So the biggest issues that we had was at the present time is with the land underneath that land, underneath those wind farms, and they're not exempt from taxation. They're just removed from our local tax roll as they're a part of the value on the state valuation. So trying to identify those lands, making sure that we are getting the correct acres and lands withdrawn from our local tax roll has been a challenge. I can tell you in Converse County, the initial report was several 100,000 acres. In the end, when we spent several weeks working on this, it came down to less than 100,000 acres, and we're still working on that. That is a problem. I don't know the solution. We've worked with the Department of Revenue, not with the new director, but I'm sure she will be willing to work with us on this. The second part of the issue is the valuation of those independent operators primarily. I understand that when you're in a regulated public utility, it's a different scenario in the valuation process, and there's some different techniques used. But when you're talking about those independent private producers, the valuation becomes a little bit more questionable because we can see a little bit more of that information. It doesn't get mixed in with the power plant and the transmission line and all those things like a public regulated company does. So I think there's still work to be done. I would like us to continue to work with the department on getting that information and maybe clearing up some of the confidentiality issues, and then really talking about, are those independent producers public utilities? And in the statutes currently, and I would certainly invite Ms. Henson to come. I'm Cinder Case. I have a little struggle with that. I've known her a long time from different names, but to help explain that process with state assessed, what is included in the state assessed and what is not. Those independent producers, are they, they're certainly electrical utilities, but are they public utilities? And how we need to maybe consider that language in the statutes. So that's where we are right now. We're still working on it. We're still talking. But if you have more questions about that, or you'd like some more clarification, she might be able to come offer some input.
Okay, appreciate the update. Any questions, Representative Sweeney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we heard the presentation from Department of Revenue on the appraised value and how they try to capitalize that. And then that determines the valuation as the way I understood it, to basically the depreciable life. And that's how they established the tax rule. And I understood at that time, which was probably a year ago, at that time that still there were these issues, but you had been invited, down to Cheyenne to go through things and try to figure things out. So what I'm hearing, and one of my questions has always been, is it say the big what is it, Cedar Springs in Converse County. So part of that, just as you described, is private and sold directly to Rocky Mountain Power, and Rocky Mountain Power owns approximately half those wind generation also. So are what you are saying is that they are taxed differently because one's under power plant, one's private on land valuation?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, they're not taxed separately or differently. They're both of those facilities, Cedar Springs, the privately independent produce, and the public regulated company, are both valued by the state of Wyoming. And they both include land, the land that's being leased. That lease payment is being capitalized into the value of the project. The difference is that there's three valuation methodologies that we all have to consider according to the appraisal world: the income approach, the comparable sales, and the cost approach. Sometimes some of that data gets lost in the reporting. So a balance sheet from a public regulated company is a different animal than a balance sheet from an independent producer. There's different regulations. Also, the income that is reported is a different reporting mechanism for some companies than the other. So when I ask for the annual reports for those two different types of companies, it's really hard for the local assessor to take that annual report and translate that into the dollars that the department got, because they have other information available to them. They may have multiple years of records. They may have federal regulated reports that they can compare for some companies. So it's still really hard to take one type of utility and compare it to the other when you're looking at valuation. Now, as far as the land, to the best of my knowledge, the land is all being capitalized into those values. And so when I get the report from the state that says, here is the lands that this producer has indicated or reported is a part of their project, these are the lands you need to take off. Working with these companies, and Cedar Springs is a new taxpayer for our county and for our state. We are the only state that asks for that kind of information in regards to the detail of the lease, according to that company. And so what they reported to the department, which then got forwarded to me to take off of the local tax roll, was very confusing, both on their side and certainly on my side. And it took us several months to sort that out. And that included the land underneath the public utility owned Rocky Mountain Power. It was the same scenario. A lot of those leases covered several phases. So you're trying to allocate land to a specific project that's very hard to identify. And I just think we need to work on a better mechanism for all that. Clearly, it's included in the value of the project, but it's very hard to pull out. As a matter of fact, I did some amended notices to ranchers in my county saying, I've been notified you have land under a wind project. I'm now removing these acres. And the concern was, no, I don't have a lease with that company. What are you talking about? And then we start this negotiation of talking about what is confidential, what is available, all those kinds of things. So it is a very complicated, sounds pretty simple, but it gets very complicated very fast. The companies have been very good to work with. The department has been helpful, but they just have access to more data than we have to establish that value. And for me, responding to my taxpayers and my constituents, when they say there was an advertisement, there was an article in the local paper that said a $625 million project just flipped the switch. So that happened in December of 19 or of 20, when they flipped the switch on that $625 million cost project. And then I get asked, what is it valued at? What are we taxing it at? Well, I can absolutely tell you it's not 625 million. I can't even tell you what it really is under the Rocky Mountain Power ownership because it's merged with all of their assets in my county. So it becomes very complicated to explain. And I do the best I can, and I'm transparent as I can, but with some of the confidentiality laws, it gets a little limited. I hope that answers your question, Representative Sweeney.
Okay, thank you.
Just a
Okay.
quick
Go
follow-up.
ahead.
So do you feel on the private side of that project, do you feel that the land that it's leased is the entire acreage of the project, or only say 1 acre underneath the tower? Once that's been capitalized and put back into the model, I can see where that's extremely complicated. So, and are we collecting then ag use on the rest of it that wouldn't be part of the project?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, I believe that the acres that are reported by the companies to the Department of Revenue is the total acres under the original lease agreement. It's not just the footprint. I know it's not just the footprint of the towers. It is the entire lease. Now, there may be multiple reasons why that lease was included, maybe buffer zone, maybe future development. I can't answer those questions, but the acres that are included in that lease payment that ultimately got capitalized by the state's valuation process is a lot more acres than the footprint of the actual structures. And so when I'm pulling those off of my local tax roll, they were agricultural. Before I pulled them off, it was agricultural land. And now it's being taxed theoretically as industrial land at industrial rates. Can I tell you how much per acre? No, I cannot, because I don't know how that falls through that formula. You know, here's the lease payment, it's capitalized, but I don't know what the lease payment was for which piece of land. So if it was being valued at average range or irrigated, I can't tell you that, so I can't give you a true estimate, but I can tell you that if I was valuing it and had it on the tax rolls as agriculture, it'd be significantly less tax dollars. That I can say with a surety than capitalizing that into the state assessed value. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair.
And tangentially wrapped up in this is the Wyoming statute. It's 39-13-102 Romanet or little m, and it's Romanet 3. And this basically says what's state assessed and property. And so it defines it's real short. It says that the department, meaning the Department of Revenue, shall annually value and assess the following property at its fair market value for taxation. They're like mines, pipelines, stuff like that. But the Romanet 3 is the property of electric utilities. And so that's puts state assessment of utility property. Well, I guarantee you when this was written, people understood what an electric utility was, and everything you saw was an electric utility. Okay. But now it's more complicated because there are power generators that are not electric utilities. They don't file reports with the Public Service Commission. Their investment isn't known. And so what's happening is the state of Wyoming assesses all electric plant, meaning independently produced power. Independent wind farms, independent transmission lines. They're not utilities. They're not utilities in Wyoming, but they come under the state assessed. Now, the amount of information that's available to do the assessment is more limited with that. And we don't have this double check that utilities have to file a lot of reports. We know what their total investment is. We can determine their average plant. All this stuff is filed both with Wyoming and the federal government. But independent power is different. So the assessors in the past have come to me and come to this committee and said, we'd like to at least see what's going on with the state assessment of the independent power production. We just want to look at the data. Well, they're forbidden from doing that without the permission of the taxpayer. And I'm kind of saying the whole thing is convoluted because they're putting non-utility plant under the state assessed and pretending it's utilities. Does this mean we're not getting the taxes we need to get or what? I don't know for sure. I don't have any idea. But I do know that I think assessors should be able to see that information and provide input. And it just makes sense. The taxes benefit local governments. That's where it goes. And the county assessor is the elected person to do that. So we had a statute change to allow for assessors to look at that data, not do the assessment, just look at the data, look at it. And we came pretty close on that one, but I think that is something this committee could do. It can only help. It doesn't hurt. And I'd like to throw that back to Ms. Huxtable to explain, if they're still on board with that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chair Case, absolutely, we're on board with that. I will tell you that we have asked for the annual reports, or at least I have. I can't speak for other assessors. And the department has provided those once the taxpayer has been notified. And in prior years, I was not able to get them all, but this year I did. But there's just so much more data that goes into just that and the valuation process than just the annual report. And you're correct. If we could see that so we could explain it back to our constituents would help. And we are the feet on the grounds. We know when blades are changed and things change. I'm not sure the department is always notified of when those things happen. So we just feel like it would be very useful to let us have a ability to do that. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Representative Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious if you happen to know off the top of your head of how many cases a year go to the Board of Equalization, and how many of those are repeat cases. And in that instance, I'm curious on what the counties are going to be able to do that the state isn't already doing, since they seem to be following Article 15, Section 11 of Wyoming Constitution under uniformity of assessment required. And there's only 3 classes, which are gross production of minerals and mine products in lieu of taxes, property used for industrial purposes as defined by the legislature, and all other property and and personal. So I'm just curious as to, I mean, it sounds like you're wanting to go outside of that, and the state's already following it and the state's already doing it. I don't see the need for you guys to take it over and have access to private sector information and therefore spread it even further outside of the hands of the government, which is already something I don't really agree with anyway. So if you could answer those for me, I'd appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, I'm making a presumption here that you're talking about wind farm appeals only.
Mr. Chairman, no, I'm talking about what the county assessors have, and then, because I'm using that as a comparison on the accuracy of how counties can do it versus how the state is doing it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, we do not have the ability to appeal state assessed values. So only the taxpayer does that, if that's what you're talking about. And how many of those appeals have went to the state board over the last several years? I do not have a count, but it's very limited. I don't think there's been one in quite some time. I don't know. I don't know why. That's not my purview to have access to that, whether it's because they settled them in a work session or the taxpayer is happy with the value. I can't answer that question.
Okay, I think this is a pretty, I mean, when you were telling us the issue of state assessed property, and my thought before Senator Case, I mean, is there anything we can do to help make this a better process? Not only, I mean, really, it's for the company, for the state, and for local governments, which really benefit from these property taxes, but is there something we can do to help? I mean, I kind of hear it a little bit in your previous conversation with the co-chairman to make sure it's accurate, right?
Mr. Chairman, yes, if we could see some more of the data that's being used for that value, it would help us understand a little bit where the values are coming from and be able to actually validate that the information that the department get is accurate. I know they believe it is, and I'm not saying it's not, but we don't know where those values come from. We can get with the confidentiality, and just to be clear, once we sign that letter asking for the data, we are signing a clause that we will not share that. We are still under the confidentiality clauses. So it's not like we get that data and are able to share it with anybody. That's just for us. But to be able to get enough of the data to look at the value to make sure something's not missing and that the value seems to be appropriate would be beneficial to the county assessors to know that when we're answering those constituent questions that we're getting everything we need between the legal descriptions for the land, the annual report, and the appraisal information, or at least the notes to know how those appraisals were established. That we think would be helpful.
I thought just the land alone, which you talked about, the amount of acres, tell us that again, that was changed, or it was told a certain amount early and then that got reduced, or how did I?
Mr. Chairman, it was when I got the initial report for that first wind farm. This was the first year in 2021 that it was on the tax rolls. The initial number of acres, when I summed up what they'd sent, was well over 300,000 acres. And then after several weeks of working with the taxpayer and trying to identify what they actually meant, it was a little under 100,000 acres.
Wow.
So it was a significant difference. And we had started out with a large number, so then we had to do notices to amend. And so it was quite time consuming in a time when we're really pretty busy as well, taking care of all the rest of the taxpayers in our county.
Thank you. You have another follow-up? Okay, wrap this up here. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So currently there are 74 open cases in the Board of Equalization as of August 1 of this year. And so my question is, how do you feel that you guys can do a better job than the state and they are not doing their jobs as it seems that's being put out there? And also, when people have repeat cases, for instance, I know of a constituent that's tried to get their land assessed correctly for the past few years. And if the county assessors have no standard operating procedure, which it seems like if there's so many cases going to the Board of Equalization, I mean, I don't see that it being necessary to put it in the county assessor's hands when the state assessor, state is already handling it. Also, regarding the information, the more times you pass that private information, the more likely it becomes that it can be put out to public view. And so I think keeping that information to limited areas within the government is a very good idea. So I was just, thank you.
Ms. Henson. I got it right. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue. First and foremost, I want to say I appreciate the county assessors bringing this question to the committee. Certainly, I will say historically, since the first wind farms, came online 20 years ago, the Department of Revenue has been valuing the wind farms, and we follow suit now with the solar projects that are out there. But I think the question that is posed by the county assessors is an important one. And due to that, I've taken a look at our statutes. As Chairman Case indicated, there is some question there. So when we look to Title 39 for some guidance on where our statute states that the department shall annually value and assess the following property at its fair market value. As discussed earlier, it does talk about property of electric utilities. It also talks about property of other public utilities. And when, since there are no definitions for that in Title 39 under Wyoming statute, I went to the U.S. Energy Information Administration to find those definitions. And so for an electric utility, which is that type that we're historically valuing wind farms under, the federal government basically says any entity that generates, transmits, or distributes electricity and recovers the cost of its generation, transmission, or distribution of assets and operations, either directly or indirectly, through cost-based rates set by a separate regulatory authority. Examples of these include investor-owned entities, public power districts, public utility districts, municipalities, rural electric cooperatives, state and federal agencies. So in that definition itself, then it basically states that for these other types, they're called independent power producers. A corporation, person, agency, authority, or other legal entity or instrumentality that owns or operates facilities for the generation of electricity for use primarily by the public, that is not an electric utility. So these definitions tend to indicate, I believe, that perhaps the Department of Revenue has been valuing wind farms in error. I really did not want my first revenue committee meeting, but I guess what I'm saying to you is, as a legislature, you have a couple of options available to you. I totally understand why the county assessor wants to understand and the basis for the appraisals of wind farms. They are a different creature than the other types of properties that the Department of Revenue values. So the options, as I see it, is if you want to address the confidentiality piece, then you probably included in that legislation want to include independent power producers in that list under Romanet M to make it clear that the Department of Revenue is the entity that is supposed to value those properties for taxation purposes. My other belief is, should you decide to do nothing, my interpretation of the statutes is that wind farms and solar farms would then be appraised by the local county assessors, and they then have access to the information just like they do refineries, coal mines. Assessors value industrial properties today. They have that appraisal education, they have the expertise. So if you do nothing, they would go back to the county assessors. They would have access to the information. So to me, that's the two options, and we will administer however the legislature deems.
Well, it's good to hear right before lunch. Maybe we can go to lunch and ponder this. And I think the first thing when we have something like this, we want to pause and think about it a little bit. Seriously. And I think there's a couple of good ways to do it. We just got to figure out what's probably the best way to do it. Think about it a little bit. Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sweeney.
So in that pondering time, do the county assessors have a recommendation? Because they've been working with the department, and I'm just wondering if those great minds.
Hey, Ms. Huxtable, was this deal already worked out beforehand, or is this just?
Maybe we got to think about this though.
Yeah.
Maybe everybody's got to think about this.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, no, this was not worked out ahead of time. There was some brief discussion about the possibility. And to be clear, we did not propose these questions to take over the valuation of wind farms. Absolutely, I will swear to that on a stack of Bibles, because I'm one of those counties that's going to get potentially hit with that. What I felt, and the other assessors involved felt we could offer some assistance to the Department of Revenue, give them some help with feet on the grounds to understand what was being reported. So that's why we were asking for the information. That's why we were trying to be involved with the valuation process, the life of the equipment, the life of the project. So no, we did not talk about this ahead of time in that perspective. I don't have a recommendation. So, I'll take this lunchtime to pause as well and talk to my other fellow assessors and see, if they have some recommendations. We have not talked about this as association. It's interesting. I about fell out of my chair too, in your case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a quick yes or no question for the director. Have you been in contact with the AG's office at all about possibly proceeding?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the property tax administrator was in contact with the AG's office. And at that point, the only discussion was the department has done it historically. Should we continue to do so or not? But I don't have an opinion from the Attorney General's office related to this. I will tell you that it's not the first time that we've entertained, should the Department of Revenue be valuing an industry. You may recall several years ago, I came before this committee and asked about airline companies. And we had been valuing airline companies historically, but we weren't sure that we were should, because they really weren't a public utility and they weren't listed in the list of properties and companies that we were required to value. So to me, this is very similar. And I don't advocate either way. All my comment is if the Department of Revenue is to continue to value these properties, perhaps we just need to make it clear within Wyoming statute. We're happy to do so.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sweeney.
So I can't imagine all county assessors have the expertise needed to value public public utility and a private company, wind generation, I'll use that. There'll be others coming down the pike. But so I want us to proceed very cautiously because I sense that I don't really think Commerce County wants to take over the total valuation process. So, but they do, I think out of respect to our assessors, they do need to know, how'd you come up with that? But so I think in that, we just need to be cautious. Would you not agree, assessor and director?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, so we use the same methodology to value all department assessed properties. We use the unitary approach to value, meaning we're valuing an entire company. And that discussion has been made as far as it is a little different approach than a county assessor typically values properties that the legislature would think of, residential, commercial, industrial, those types. But we all consider an income approach to value and what information we've got and the credibility of that information. So right now, the county assessors have the ability to see all of the annual report, basically everything that taxpayer provided to the Department of Revenue in order to value that property. What we don't have the ability to share with them is our actual appraisal. As Ms. Huxtable indicated, it's, the multiple years. If we're tracking the income stream over multiple years, and then how do we look at that income stream? So for whatever reason, at this point, it's the wind farms that they would like to see just that appraisal piece of it, I believe. And I don't have a concern with that. All I'm stating is that if that's the direction the legislature wants to go, let's just make it clear that we are the entity that's appraising them as well.
So, Mr. Chairman, would one way to figure this all out is let these guys talk and figure out what would work best. I mean, we want the information thing, we want the appraisal done, we want to be consistent. They're gonna, these are the pros, and they'll figure it out. Let them talk together. And we can be flexible enough to let them come up with a proposal if we need a statute change that they suggest, and we talk about it next time. We get it on our agenda.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your service. Okay, members, I think we're gonna go ahead and break here now. And
We have till 1:30.
we're gonna go till 1:30. 1:30, we'll pick back up again. Thank you all for your attendance.